Hey, what's up? It's cute what if this side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku becomes monster. Now before we move ahead with the fic, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Izuku woke up earlier than usual. He got dressed in his high school uniform and headed out into the kitchen. His mom was heading out of her room at the same time, and they crossed paths. There was a warm exchange that Izuku loved every morning. This included a nice long hug from his Inko. He was feeling twitchy today, though, and his mom could sense it. So the hug was quick. There was so much power flooding through his veins. He hurriedly ate his breakfast that his mother made him, thanking her and saying goodbye. He went to school. Upon getting there, he kept his head down even as the swarm of students around him gossiped about the news this morning. Izuku got to his classroom and took his seat near the window. There were small groups chattering before the bell rang, yet he was excluded because of his quirklessness. Though in some cases, like now, it was a blessing. Did you hear? Uobami was found dead. Of course we did, Hina-san. It was all over the news this morning. The two people, a girl and a boy respectively, stared at each other in a deadpan for a moment, before the girl, Hina, apparently, responded, I know that, but apparently the police said that this villain was a serial killer for more than half a year now. The boy, Izuku thought his name was Futama ... or something, had a shocked look on his face, making his eyebrows scrunch up. Izuku's smile was covered by his hand. Suddenly, his head spasmed to the right slightly. It didn't hurt, but it definitely surprised him. Luckily for him, no one noticed. The teacher chose that moment of tension to walk into the classroom to start the class. The groups of students dissipated, and they went to their seats. Izuku tuned her out, not bothering to pay attention. His eyes wandered around the classroom, not focusing on any one thing. Deku. Izuku's eyes were at the teacher at lightning speed, his gaze intense enough to make the teacher fumble with what she was about to say. Don't, he spasmed again, the movement shaking his frame. Call me that. The eyes of the whole class were on him now. Some of the students were whispering to each other. Izuku's hands gripped his desk in a claw-like manner, and he was struggling to control himself. He took a deep breath, centering himself, before calmly looking back at his teacher with a neutral expression. The teacher, rightly so, was off-put by this strange behavior, but she continued on, Midoriya, then. Pay attention, this is what will be on your final exams. Even with the warning, he couldn't be bothered to listen to things he already knew. Unfortunately, the odd exchange with his teacher garnered some unwanted attention from the rest of his classmates. They stared, and they whispered, and the teacher didn't even seem to notice. He didn't want to deal with this right now, so he leveled a glare at those who were blatantly staring. They hastily looked away, but Izuku knew that it wouldn't last. He was right, it didn't last. The bell rang, signaling lunch, yet surprisingly enough, no one moved until Izuku got up and walked out of the classroom. They all got up, walked out of the classroom, and constantly attempted to corner him. His twitching was getting worse. He got to his locker, putting his books in. He slammed the door shut, with a lot more force than he usually did. Some of his classmates approached. His hand was still on the locker, and his gaze was focused down. They tried to get his attention, but all he heard was a shrill white noise in his head. Finally, that Furama guy, or whatever, snapped his fingers in front of his face. This made his head snap up, and his eyes directly locked with the other boys. There were people in the hallway watching the exchange. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. There were 3 boys, yet as he snapped his head up to look at them, the one to the right of the Furama dude yelled out, What the F, man? Before he turned tail and clumsily ran the opposite direction. 1 down, 2 to go. Not that Izuku was counting. He twitched violently, and that threw his head forward slightly, which was enough to get closer to the second boy, who, being closer now, could feel something not quite right with his classmate. He realized that he wasn't even looking Izuku in the face, and when he did, that feeling of oddity cemented right into place, especially when he saw too many eyes in front of him. He staggered backward, but wasn't about to back down, yet it was when he saw the mouths that he suddenly looked nauseous. He turned around and followed his companion. Either Furama couldn't tell, or he was just too block-headed to notice the difference in Izuku. Either way, the way Izuku was smiling at him was off-putting. Ni, Furama-sen, why don't you get out of my way before I make you? The boy's legs were quivering like jelly at this point, and Izuku didn't know if he was brave or stupid. He pointed at Izuku and said, Why the hell would I listen to a quirkless freak like you? Everyone in the hallway jumped when a loud bang echoed throughout the hallway. They all stared in morbid fascination because they didn't even see him move. In an instant, Izuku had Furama pinned against the wall by his neck, and a fist in the locker right next to his head. The metal of the locker bent completely to the strength of the punch, and any closer to Furama's head, they would be scraping bits of his brain off the ground. Everyone couldn't help but take a step backwards at the look on the normally timid boy's face. His eyes were wide, and a wickedly gleeful look was on his face, like he was happy that his classmate was in pain. He twitched again, but as he did so, his form blurred, turning into something nameless for merely an instant, but reverting back to normal before anyone could properly identify what it was. The shell-shocked boy crumpled like a sack of potatoes when Izuku let go of him. He turned to walk towards the cafeteria and the large group of students that had just watched the transaction split, letting him through easily. When Izuku got home from school, he went straight to his room and doubled over. He started salivating and even drooling. There was too much power in his system. It was overflowing his veins and setting his blood alight like a spark to gasoline. He knew that Uebami was more powerful than Death Arms, yet it seems he didn't quite realize the level she was on, until he tasted that delicious heart of hers. It was like a delicacy to him, and he wanted more. A deranged laugh escaped him as he twitched violently and fell onto his side. But he forced himself up and locked his door, sending a quick text to his mom that she shouldn't be in his sight today. More unhinged sounds came from him. He'd suppressed it all for so long. He needed to get it out of his system once in a while. Just then, his burner phone started ringing. He shakily answered it. "Akutani, we require your presence at the bar," Chirujiri said on the other end of the line. Then, on cue, a wispy, dark swirling portal opened up in front of him, making him glad that he had already changed out of his high school uniform. However, Quicklash was a twitching mess and was only barely able to walk through the portal in a dignified manner. But it didn't last long, as he collapsed to his knees on the floor, violently twitching all the while. "There's no way this clumsy effing kid is a notorious villain. Stop messing with us." No one dared breathe as the kid fell from his knees and onto the floor. But instead of face planting, he melted into a writhing mass of symbiotic-looking goo consisting of hundreds of eyes and jagged teeth. The massive writhing eldritch grew in size, taking up a sizable chunk of the bar space, before coalescing into an unidentifiable Inkai black maw. The creature was looking down over the man who was the unfortunate spokesperson of what everyone else was thinking. Black ink dripped onto the face of the man, which mixed with the sweat already dripping from his face. The man knew he was staring death himself in the face. Most of the creature's eyes directed themselves towards Shigaraki, who, even with all of his hands properly secured on his person, looked slightly taken aback. "EA, do whatever you want, he's just an annoying bot. Not even worth my time." The eyes turned back to the main focus of Quicklash's attention, and the spectating occupants of the bar knew how this was going to end. But they didn't. The mass of a creature suddenly burrowed its head into the neck of the man, and made its way down, spurting blood everywhere. It reached the heart of the man, before absorbing itself into the now corpse. All was silent. Then the corpse exploded in a controlled circle, leaving the carnage to be absorbed back into the growing creature. Finally, after a few moments of tense waiting, the mass shrunk and regained its color, turning back into a green-haired boy. Izuku let off a radiating smile, held up a peace sign, and said, "Sorry about that. You caught me at a bad time. But I'm good now." If any of those people had doubts about this boy, it was long gone. Shigaraki blinked at him, then raised his eyebrow, gave an exasperated sigh, and began informing Izuku that the many people in front of him were some of the informants they had in the press. After his explanation, Izuku squinted his eyes, and walked up to one of them. Funnily enough, he actually recognized one of them, as they were the art teacher at his high school. He hadn't met him yet, because he didn't take art. He knew the teacher knew about him though, not directly, but as the only quirkless kid in the school. "Tamura-sensei," he asked. The man looked startled. "Who are you?" He responded with a puzzled look on his face. The man nervously adjusted his glasses. A polite smile rested on Izuku's face as he leaned in to whisper in the man's ear, "Don't you know? I'm the only quirkless kid in Aldera High School," Izuku said smugly as he leaned back to watch Tamura's expression, who seemed as though he was still processing what Izuku said. Leaving the man where he was, he stepped back once more to address the crowd of informants. "Remember, if any of this gets leaked, who I actually am, and anything personal about me, I'm hunting all of you down, and adding both you and your families to my collection." "Collection?" Shigi asked. Izuku turned around to face him, and gave him a childish pout. "Yes, my collection. Didn't you know?" He looked around and made eye contact with everyone in the bar. "The HPSC named me the Soul Stealer for a reason." He turned back to look at Tamura, and was pleased to note that the man had turned white as a sheet. Another person to torture, how exciting. After his little presentation, he hopped up on one of the bar stools, and perched there. Apparently, the informants were here to let the League know that, thanks to Quicklash's debut, there are more heroes prowling the streets, and that All Might has been more active on the case. Izuku had his lips at the thought of more heroes to consume. He also realized that this was why Shigi had required his presence. He was soon allowed to leave, but not before messing with Tamura, who actually looked like he was about to cry. His official first day of his police internship went surprisingly well. Izuku honestly thought that the job seemed more daunting than it actually was. Maybe it was because everyone was so nice to him. God, his standards were so low. Despite the fact that he was at a police station of all places, he was in his element. He had never known that his so-called creepy or useless skill was actually helpful to people. But apparently, hero analysis was a widely applauded skill in the hero community, and it was one that not a lot of people had a knack for. Tsukachi was so nice, but he did have to be careful around his quirk. After the initial hiring, workday, the detective asked some basic follow-up questions. But when he asked, "Have you committed any crimes in the past?" Izuku had to focus on the past. Before he attacked anyone, and even before he attacked the cat when he was 12. He responded, "No," and Tsukachi didn't press, so Izuku hoped that was a win for him. Surprisingly, the work he was doing wasn't even boring. though that may have been because it was his first day on the job, and anything new wouldn't be boring in the first place. A little later in the day, Tsukachi had a meeting he had to attend, which left Izuku with the rest of the paperwork to do. He got it done surprisingly fast, and put them in the appropriate file drawers. When he went out to tell one of the officers that he finished, he nearly ran into someone. When he looked up, he saw the face of All Might himself staring down at him. Izuku made his eyes practically light up at the sight of him. All Might. Hi. Oh my goodness, I'm such a big fan. He slapped a hand over his mouth before he could jumble too many words into one breath. All Might's breath stuttered. The same boy. It couldn't be. Young man, were you perhaps at the ... Izuku's eyes took on a look of slight confusion. Before he went with the story he told Katsuki. No sir. Kaken said he faced someone there pretending to be me, and even knew stalker-like info about him and me. It was so weird. He shuddered, for added effect. Some of the tension seemed to bleed from All Might's shoulders, and Izuku smiled politely at him. Before things got too awkward, Tsukachi showed up from somewhere behind All Might, and was surprised, and slightly intimidated, by the paperwork that Izuku had gotten done. Apparently, that was all of his backed-up work too. All Might still looked apprehensive, as was his right, yet he let it slide ... for now. There was something about the kid that rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was because he was too happy for a quirkless kid. Or maybe it was because of the way the room dropped a few degrees in temperature. Either way, it was something to look into. The harsh beats of wings permeated the forest, creating a disturbance in the otherwise peaceful day. She was back. People came out of their houses, and the elders out of the courthouse. They were eager to see what news she brought. After all, it's been years since she left. She landed on the ground in a clearing. The citizens of the forest kneeled with reverence, as she stood as tall as ever, towering over even the strongest of them. The revolution has begun, led by my son. Whispers broke amongst the crowd. After so many years, nearly a millennia, something has changed. Several pairs of wings flapped, creating a whirlwind that swirled around the grass and flowers, stirring up pollen that caused some of the fletchlings to sneeze. There was no cry of outrage, nor of disbelief, because no one dared to question their leader. The storm brewed in the distance, signaling the start of a new era of disparity. Instead of the mishap with that hero student, Shoto and Hitoshi had actually gone out and committed some actual arson a few weeks later. Izuku was hungry though, and besides that little stint, he didn't think his boys were actually down with murder. So he went out again, mindless and cruel. He was destroying people's mailboxes. Actually, it was just one, but that didn't really matter. And he wasn't really mindless, because he had a plan in mind. It had taken a lot of planning out of trial and error, and even then, the plan was iffy. It relied a lot on the part the police played in this. So no, this wasn't a regular hunt, there was a goal in mind. A few weeks earlier, Tsukachi was worried about his intern. Yes, it had to do with his quirklessness, but it wasn't the usual concern of people. Tsukachi knew what it was like to be ostracized because of his lack of quirk. Of course, it was always there, but he knew that he was just lucky. The world has become a lot more hateful of quirkless people than when he was in school, and it was becoming more and more obvious. It was starting to get even more dangerous with a new supervillain prowling the precinct. Probably not his best idea, but he gave the kid a taser. For protection. Because while not on patrol with other officers, who knows what villains would target a kid, quirkless or not, because of his association with the police. So yes, a taser. Better safe than sorry. The boy obviously had a good head on his shoulders, and it's a shame he was rejected his whole life, because he would have made a fantastic hero, especially with that analysis skill of his. Tsukachi sat down on his desk. Despite the very welcome distraction and help that Midoriya brought to the office, there's still no update on the Soul Stealer case. They have some sort of lead though, finally. He delegated some poor schmuck in his department to the days since last human snack attack counter. He eventually got back on track to a less scream-inducing case. Present day. Izuku stood without hiding himself in the shadows of the alley. Instead, he stood out, slightly in the open, taser in hand. He felt kind of bad about causing Tsukachi so much stress. But in the long run, he couldn't care less. He was hungry, but he wouldn't let that stop his only chance at this. He stepped out into the open, right as a businessman walked by. He grabbed the man by the neck of his blazer, lightly tasing his arm, before holding it up to his neck. "Give me your money." He made it obvious that it was a scuffle. He was good at this by now, he knew how to be discreet. But that was not the goal here. The goal here was to be noticed. And noticed he was. It was the working rush hour, about 5, in a busy part of town. There were police officers everywhere, keeping an eye on traffic, and that's who noticed him. They surrounded him, trying to get him to stand down. He would have, but he needed enough of a charge to be in jail for a while. So that's why no money was given, and Izuku tased the man's neck. Not enough to kill him, but enough to do some damage. The officers around him pulled out their guns and aimed it at his head. Izuku quickly put his hands up and dropped the taser on the ground. As it fell, it bonked him on the nose, which caused him to sneeze really cutely. Some officers gave a shaky and hesitant laugh, but quickly returned to their serious expressions. After a relatively easy transition into the police car and being brought into the station, and towards the interrogation room, it was none other than Tsukachi himself who walked in. Izuku grimaced. The detective pinched the bridge of his nose in what was clear exasperation. He only asked one question, why? Izuku fidgeted under his intense stare. I needed to cause a scene. Tsukachi's right eye twitched, which meant that it registered as a truth. If his left eye had twitched, then that means a lie was told to him. A deep sigh escaped the detective. And why, pray tell, did you want to cause a scene? Izuku laughed awkwardly. I needed to be able to go to jail because the people there wouldn't let me visit my friend just because I was quirkless. The man's right eye twitched again, and he never stopped pinching the bridge of his nose as he ordered some officers to take Izuku to a holding cell. There, he could await a transfer to a minimum security prison, and stay there for a few weeks. As he walked out, he yelled behind him at Tsukachi, sorry for abusing my taser privileges. There was no response, only a loud thunk as the man's head hit the table. When he got situated at the prison, he found that the only thing truly bad about it was the fact that he had to hide his quirk. Well, all except for the blind spots in the cameras, of course. It was a minimum security prison for a reason. It was funny, really. He had gotten settled down into his prison cell while the other prisoners were in the yard. Then, his cellmate for the next few months came back. It was this hulking man who looked like he was here for assault or something. Hi, what's your name? Izuku said, overly cheery. The man was brutish, and merely responded with one-word answers. But he was overall rather nice. When asked about what got him there, he looked down at his hands. I didn't have enough money to buy my daughter a dollhouse. So I tried to take one, but I got caught. It was a softer reason than Izuku had thought, and a softer reason than why he was here. They got to know each other because, well, they were kind of stuck with each other. When Izuku offered to be the man's protection, it got a small chuckle out of the man. No, I'm serious. He gave a small stare at the camera, signaling his mole on the prison guard to disable this camera. When the red dot of the camera switched off, he switched to his more threatening persona, a gargled mess of eldritch horror, yet he remained in a passive stance toward the man. The man staggered backward a half step with the change of this teenage boy. I can be your protection, but you can't tell anyone about me, Izuku said, his voice slightly warped. Deal, the man responded. The smiles of the mouths widened to a frightening degree, before shifting back into the form that was a teenage boy. It was just in time too, as the red light of the camera switched back on just then. So that had been the first day, and Izuku thought that it had gone rather well since then. Within a week, all the other prisoners were scared of him. Even with his cellmate walking around beside him, the guards thought he was Izuku's bodyguard. But the rest of the prisoners knew differently. There was one day, about a week later, that his cellmate's daughter came to visit him. It was the sweetest thing, because she was adorable, and also because his cellmate trusted him enough to let her around him. He made scary faces at her from behind the man and through the glass separating them. She was giggling at the faces Izuku was making. They were ridiculous. He soon left them to have their alone time. Walking into the yard, he ran into a group of hard-headed men that still hadn't caught on to how dangerous Izuku was. Where's your bodyguard, twerp? Izuku huffed. He really wasn't in the mood to handle this. Unbeknownst to him, his eyes turned a deep crimson as he turned to look at them. Hidden from a nearby camera's view, his hand morphed into a claw. The man's face then drained of its color. A dark smile made its way onto Izuku's face. The man motioned his flunkies to back down. All but one did. Izuku waited until the man threw the first punch, before using one hand to grab his shirt and the other to punch him in the face. The man was knocked off his feet and onto his back. He only had enough time to barely struggle before a foot was planted right on his sternum. The foot belonged to the kid whom he'd thought was a twig being bodyguarded by his cellmate. The man only now realized he had it all wrong. So he did what any sane man would do. Please, I'm sorry. I'll leave you alone. Don't kill me, the man pleaded pitifully. The smile turned to a smirk as Izuku bent down to lean into the man's ear. You're lucky. If we weren't being monitored, you'd be 6 feet deep the moment you started talking. He stood up from where he was crouched. This was getting old. There were only a few days left, and he had to bear through them. Training camp. The middle of nowhere. Hitoshi was so sweaty. He'd been training his physical body for hours now. Since, according to Aizawa-sensei, his physique effing sucked. His words, not Hitoshi's. At least Shoto got to practice with his quirk. He was just stuck here trying to land a hit on Tiger. It was only a few more days. A few more days until he could get out of this hellhole. But he had to be patient. He couldn't blow his cover early. If that happened, then Zuko will have spent that time in prison for nothing. Instead of hero work, Shoto was training his quirk for the purpose of his upcoming debut. They would have both of them do it, but they still needed a mole at UA. So that's why Hitoshi is staying behind, because he's a convincing actor, and they're both being kidnapped. Hitoshi would have more of a reason for becoming a villain, so that's why it would work better on his willpower against the villain's evil machinations. Hitoshi himself personally thought it was hilarious. And besides Hitoshi, there was no one else he really had a connection with. Except for Ida. He knows about Zuko, so he's off the hook about the whole thing. The moment Izuku was let out of prison, he ran and hugged his mom, before going to hug Tsukachi, who had been the one to release him. He used the signature Midoriya crocodile tears on him, and got his trench coat wet, as he promised not to abuse his taser privileges ever again. Tsukachi just patted him in awkward fondness. Izuku gave one more tighter squeeze, whispering, This is the last time you'll hear this from me. I'm so sorry," before letting go and wishing him well, leaving the detective baffled. Later that night, Izuku sat with the rest of the league, no disguise in sight. The Vanguard action squad was assembled. This included the one he detested, Muscular, the son of a beach killed little kids for fun. Izuku understood sometimes killing teenagers for fun and even pleasure. But kids, he didn't go that far off. Shigi was due to stay behind on this one, much to said man's displeasure. Izuku was in charge of half the Vanguard, Dabai was in charge of the other. The portal appeared, meaning it was time for the students' test of courage. Izuku stepped through. He was hungry and ready for carnage. He spread his designated group to wreak havoc, even Muscular, whom he detested. Izuku couldn't help but let loose a smile at the smell of the forest burning. It had been a while since he could do something like this. His tongue grew long as he ate his lips. He stopped in the middle of the path of courage, before any of the students realized what was happening. He took on the visage of a scared child. And that's how a pair of hero class students stumbled across him, leaning against a tree, acting like he was in pain. They stopped what they were doing to help him. What true heroes they were. It was too bad they had to die so soon. Kaminari Denki, age 15. Quirk, electrification. You discharge a large electric shock that leaves you mentally stunted for approximately 12.25 minutes. Izuku said as he rose up to face the student trying to help him. Said boy took a few steps back. Why yo dude, this is a good scare for this test thingy. But I haven't seen you in class BU Gen Ed or something. Izuku Quicklash didn't respond to him. He merely turned his eyes toward the other student. Kirishima Ijiru, age 15. Quirk, hardening. Self-explanatory, Quicklash pierced the boy with a stare. I remember you. I gave you quite the bruise, didn't I? Unless you can also withstand being flung through a wall. It only took but a second for the red-haired boy to realize. And when he did, he spun to face the blonde, yet not taking his eyes off Quicklash. Denki, we have to get out of here, now. Kaminari looked lost. You know this kid. Kirishima gripped his shoulder tightly. Denki, run and get Aizawa-sensei. I'll hold him off. Kaminari didn't argue, and started to run, only to fall onto the ground. He wondered why he failed to catch himself, only realizing when a searing pain shot up his right arm. No, where his right arm was supposed to be. He screamed out in pain. Kirishima whipped his head over to him, only to see his best friend without a right arm, and this monster with blood-stained teeth, and an awful smile on its face. Actually, to Kirishima, he seemed more monstrous than before. Quicklash laughed, and left, and left. He stopped laughing abruptly, sniffing the air, before bolting in a single direction. Kirishima ran over from where he was frozen in fear. He tore his shirt, trying to staunch the blood flow of his best friend's shoulder. Stay with me, Den. Quicklash made it to a cliffside, where Muscular had cornered a child. His blood boiled in his veins as he launched himself and took a bite out of the man. It didn't do much because of the excess muscle on the villain's body. The small boy, who couldn't have been more than 7, was shaking in terror. He felt like he was going to die the same way his parents did. He was so close to death when that stupid villain stopped. He saw the reason that the villain stopped was because of another villain. Quicklash was beyond anger. He was livid. All he could see was a bully. A bully who looked down on those below him for no good reason. All he could see was Katsuki. He grew and grew until his maw cut off the top part of the villain. Muscular was dead, and Quicklash shrunk down to his human self once more. He turned to look at the small child, who was trying his best to hide himself from him. Quicklash knelt down and gently grabbed the child's arms. I wouldn't let him touch a kid, you know. The kid finally looked up at him, scared, but no longer terrified. Who are you? He looked the kid in the eye. The official name, or my name? The boy said, both. The green-haired villain smiled. My official name is Quicklash, the Soul Stealer. A gasp escaped the boy, but you can call me Izuku. Kauta had tears rolling down his cheeks, but he did the unexpected thing. He jumped up to hug his hero, regardless of him being a villain. It obviously took Quicklash by surprise, but he returned the hug after a moment of hesitation. When released from the hug, Quicklash told him, go back to your guardian, whoever they are, and I can promise not to hurt you nor them. The smile he got in return warmed his heart. My guardians are Mandalay of the Wildcats. Quicklash reaffirmed his statement, before sending Kauta off. He brought the radio up. Listen up, none of you are to harm a small kid named Kauta. He's about 7. Nor are you allowed to harm Mandalay of the Wildcats. This is an order from your superior. The last person who disobeyed is Muscular, who is missing the top half of his body. Everyone else is free game. Dabe rolled his eyes at the message, but affirmed it. That kid had such a soft heart sometimes. Quicklash was running back through the forest, and he stopped for a moment to assess. He was glad he did, because he could sense someone short creeping up behind him. He smiled and turned around to grab the person's neck, only to find that the person was invisible, and he ended up grabbing her face instead. Well, what do we have here? A hero student trying to play martyr. Why, you were the one who MMPH she struggled to speak properly. You were the one who nearly raped Bakugo. Quicklash's smile quickly turned sour as he used his free hand to punch her in the nose. Blood spurted onto her face, which was a helpful marker of her exact location, especially when he flung her across the clearing. You were there, weren't you, Hagakure Toru? Hagakure's form tensed, but before she could book it, he was in her face. It's a shame, being in the hero course. I bet no one will miss you when you die. Though he couldn't see it, he could sense how her face lit up with anger. That's not true. They'll miss me. They'll look for me. They won't forget me. She yelled, though she sounded more like she was reassuring herself. Quirklash bent down to her crumpled form on the ground. Are you sure about that? Hagakure's form retreated into itself, showing just what she thought about it. How about this? He had her attention. Do you want to be seen? There was a tentative affirmative. Then you could leave this hero sit behind and become free. He held out his arms in front of him, like he was holding the world in his hands. And when we conquer the world, you can be seen and by my side, or dead at my feet like the rest of these effing ants. A small laugh escaped him as he stepped back to stare up at the full moon highlighting the shadows of the forest. I'm not a rapist, Hagakure-sen. He looked down at the bloody form of Hagakure, and he said, you have about an hour to make your decision. Quirklash then melted into the shadows as if he were never there. Toru had to make a decision here. She wanted to become a hero to be seen, didn't she? Her friends were fine, but sometimes they forgot she was there. But that was normal, and she couldn't fault them for it. But this villain knew she was there without even having to see her. Maybe with him she could finally be seen, and not ignored. It seems she's made her decision, and it hadn't even been 10 minutes. Instead of running out in the open, Quirklash stuck to the trees, which is how he stumbled upon his Hitoshi and Ida together, trying and failing to fend off Mr. Compress. He watched as Hitoshi seemingly ran out of breath, letting Compress capture him. Ida tried to reach out and take Hitoshi, but that's when Quirklash stepped in and restrained him. He quickly covered Ada's mouth. Don't call me that here. Call me Quirklash. He slowly lifted the hand covering Ada's mouth. That's who you are. The yelling grated on Quirklash's ears. Shut up. You're being too loud. The demand only worked for about a second, before Ida said again, oh, I'm the one being too loud. He was challenging him, wasn't he? Quirklash put both of Ida's hands into one of his, as he used the other to harshly grip his neck. He had the main artery at Ida's jugular. I don't think you want to threaten me, hero. Not when your neck looks so delectable. Ida froze up, remembering his place, but it was too late to backtrack for him. Quirklash dug his teeth into the boy's neck, not too deep, so not enough to bleed out. But it was enough to be painful. He drank and drank. He was about 4 gulps in when he could sense something heading toward him, fast. He tried to quickly let go of Ida, but was a tad too slow. A long tongue wrapped around his midsection and yanked. It took him away from Ida and toward a frog girl from the same class. He landed on his back, leaving himself vulnerable. I've got one of them. Sit. About 4 more people ran out from the underbrush. Luckily, one of them was Shoto. The others were Kendo Itsuka, Shoji Mezu, Takoyami Fumikage, and Oasios Su. They surrounded him, and Kendo went over to check on Ida, while the rest of them kept watch over Quirklash. He took on a desperate look, and a childish voice, please help me. The villains are forcing me to work for them. The group looked at each other, and Oase spoke up. Dude, he's like, our age. Izuku churned out fake tears. I have done bad things. But they keep threatening my family. A choked cough sounded from behind them. Everyone looked but Takoyami, who kept his eyes on Quirklash the whole time. Because of this, he was the only one to see the darkening of his face as Ida managed, in a choked voice, Dauntless tend to him. The frog girl, Asuitsuyu, reaffirmed that statement. TCH. The majority of the group turned back to look at the down villain, the previous childish fright wiped clean, including the tears. Fine, you got me. I would love to stay and chat, but you see, I don't have the time. He said, relaxing in the restraints and closing his eyes. The hero students weren't falling for it, but that's okay, Quirklash didn't need them to. His eyes snapped open as he transformed. He lunged at the first hero student he could get his hands on, snapping at his head, and successfully decapitating the boy. Oasios Su. He rapidly went down to eat the heart of the boy. The large power boost gave him the energy to rip free of those holding him, and leap back into the trees. He circled around the camp to throw them off his trail. He went back to the clearing where he met Hagakure, who was still there. He landed in front of her, startling her. Have you made your decision? She sat there for a moment. Yes, I have. I'm coming with you. She responded. Good. Hop on. He bent down to let her on his back. She climbed up and held on as he leapt from the clearing, making his way toward the rendezvous point. He stopped and let her off, informing the others that she was with them now. Dabai took it with a grain of salt. Quirklash looked at Compress, who held up 2 marbles. Now that the group got what they wanted, the rest of them stepped through the portal. Aizawa was distraught. He was sure they were in a remote location, but the League of Villains still found them. Some of his own students were gravely injured, like Ida, who had a lot of the blood drained out of his neck like a vampire. Many 1B kids were injured, and 1 was killed. 2 of his own were taken, and for what purpose they don't know. There was only a small bit of good news, and it still wasn't very good. The bottom half of the infamous villain Muscular had been found, but it had obviously been done by an enemy and not an ally. Well, actually there was one other thing. Kauta, Mandalay's nephew, had been saved by the villain who killed Muscular. Aizawa had asked if the villain had been given a name. He had. Quirklash, the Soul Stealer. A shiver went up his spine. Now they knew that the infamous villain was with the League. This made them even more dangerous. It was amazing that Kauta had an encounter with the Soul Stealer and survived. He just hoped his students were okay. When they stepped into the bar, there were already 2 chairs with restraints on them. Izuku sat Hagakure down in one of the chairs, and Shinsu in the other, then he restrained them. He had compressed let Todoroki out. Hitoshi put on his metaphorical acting hat then. They didn't know if they could trust Hagakure yet. He gripped the arms of the chair as much as he could. Todoroki, what are you doing? Help us out of here, he yelled. Todoroki gave him a bit of a condescending look. Is that so? Why should I help my enemy? Shinsu whipped his head around, shocked. Why your enemy? What? That can't be right. Shinsu had an outright affronted look on his face. You're a villain. I thought we were friends. Todoroki merely shrugged. We can be if you still want it. You could join us. Toru watched the interaction with fascination, and jumped when Shinsu stomped his feet. Like hell. There was white-hot anger on his face. I haven't come this far in the hero course to be what everyone else in my life has told me to become, because of my quirk. A bitter laugh escaped him. You really think I would stoop so low? Todoroki's face remained apathetic. It was worth a shot. He turned to face Toru. And you, Hagakure, why are you here? She sighed. There's an endgame goal to this here, isn't there? Everyone knew it wasn't an actual question. I'd rather be on the side of the victors who don't have qualms about doing dirty work to get their way. I'd like to be seen. No one saw it, but she smiled. Ironic, isn't it? For the first time since she met him, Todoroki lit his hand on fire. He brought it close to her face. And why would we believe you, hero student? He asked. Toru took a deep breath. There's nothing about my quirk that's offensive. You all could kill me, easily. But I would be a great asset to you, especially with my invisibility. Well said. She turned to the person who spoke, only to find that it came from a computer that reads sound only. Tamura, let her go. The man with the hands all over him came over to her and disintegrated her bonds, allowing her to stand up. Toru walked over to stand beside Todoroki, who were both facing Shinsu. He visibly grit his teeth, glaring at all 3 of his former friends. You effing traitors. Magni, who was standing off to the side with a video camera, shut it off and said, done. Toru was startled. Huh. We were being filmed. Yup. She turned around to see Hitoshi standing up after being released from his restraints. Wait, I thought you were against all this. He looked at her and snorted. Yeah, that was all an act, Cupcake. She sputtered. Cupcake, what? Don't worry about it, Hagakure. Izuku said. She turned to see the creature as the same villain who offered her the choice. By the way, what's your villain name? I only know you by one thing, and apparently that was a fluke. Izuku blinked owlishly, realizing that she was correct. He giggled childishly, making everyone but Shoto and Hitoshi take a step back from him. Oh, I forgot. He opened his eyes from where they were closed while he was laughing. I'm Quirkless. The heroes have nicknamed me the Soul Stealer. Hitoshi patted his head affectionately. Izuku, stop scaring the new recruit shitless. The pouting face he received was too cute for a notorious supervillain. The face didn't last long though, because he brightened up and went over to the bar. Shiggy, I'm back to annoy you. Shigaraki groaned and his head hit the bar counter. I had thought there was finally peace. He grumbled, head still on the table. Hagakure blinked. She saw this villain at the USJ. He was unhinged and manic, but here, he seemed like a human being. They all did. Villains were often stigmatized as beings of evil who hate society. The belief is fair, but it seemed to take away the fact that they were real people, with real emotions. Darling, I am loving your style, said a very muscular-looking woman. Hagakure practically preened under the attention. Izuku took the remote and turned on the TV, where breaking news has taken over every news station. 2 hero students have been kidnapped by the infamous League of Villains. A press conference will be taking place tomorrow night. And that's when they'll strike, finished Izuku. He turned to look at the rest of the occupants of the bar. The press conference will be a cover, and we'll have to be ready to move to a secondary location. Quirkless is correct. The sound of the computer on the counter crackled to life. Izuku smiled at the phrase, but it quickly disappeared as he groaned to himself. He uttered. I ate a hero student, he explained when multiple heads turned his direction. He lifted his head up to look at the ceiling and he opened his mouth like he was yawning. But his mouth kept going until his head folded over onto itself. It kept going until their impending questions were answered when Izuku's body turned symbiotic. Hitoshi and Shoto were startled, because they hadn't experienced this before. The writhing mass of symbiotic goop creeped over to the 2 boys, and it grew and changed until there was a creature the size of a large house cat rubbing against their legs. Hagakure couldn't help it. She laughed as she momentarily forgot the agonizing pain deep in her heart when the news had announced that only 2 hero students were missing. Shigaraki then told everyone to go to bed, and when it was just him and Izuku left, he turned back into human form. I'm going hunting, was all he said, before he walked through the door of the bar and disappeared into the night. Izuku walked down the empty streets of Kamino. He mostly stuck to lesser-known streets where heroes wouldn't be patrolling. Not that they were, because of the very recent training camp debacle, but that's where he found his preferred victim. Unluckily for the victim, Izuku wasn't in the mood for a quick meal. Yutaka Hinamori. The girl from his homeroom class whipped around at the sound of her name. When she found it was just the supposed quirkless kid, she let her body relax slightly. But after the events of a week ago, no one in the school dared say that he was quirkless. One couldn't be quirkless to pull a stunt like that. Why yes, Midoriya-san. His smile was dark, and it unsettled her in a way that shouldn't. There's a serial killer running around. Isn't it dangerous to be walking around after dark? She was again reminded of the face he made when pinning Furama to the wall of lockers, the metal shaping itself around his fist, mere inches from his victim's head. A cold snap of dread hit her like a freight train. Victims, right. That's what the bully was. It wasn't the other way around. Furama had been at the mercy of Midoriya, not the other way around. And then came Midoriya's words. He was right, there was a serial killer running around. How could she have forgotten? Midoriya has seemed different for a while now. His whole demeanor had changed. He seemed more he seemed more predatory. Her head whipped around to look at him from where she'd been staring at the ground, lost in thought. The smile on his face had gotten wider and wider, stretching from ear to ear. He slowly walked toward her, and her feet were frozen in place. Hina-san, I've done my usual research. Do you want to know which serial killer is running around currently? He stopped in front of her, which showed a major height difference between the two of them. He wasn't always so tall, was he? He bent down until they were face to face, mere inches from each other. It's me. Her legs were backpedaling before she even had the conscious thought to do so. His hand grabbed her shirt, yanking her back. His other hand took hold of her face, 2 fingers holding her chin. With horror, she watched as his face subtly shifted. His teeth and tongue grew. Inhuman as they were, the only thing they did currently was making the sudden glee on his face become more prevalent. To think, a kid in her class, a serial killer. It was also the kid they'd least expect, which for some reason, makes the revelation worse. The question plagued her, which one are you? Her voice involuntarily trembled. He threw his head back and laughed maniacally. She'd never seen this side of Midoriya. It was terrifying. His eyes were crazed, and it seemed like he'd been far gone for a while. I thought that was easy, silly. He threw her against the brick wall of the alley, making her cry out. Everybody knows about the Soul Stealer, don't they? Said Quirkless as Hina fell to the ground. She was shaking in terror. He crouched down in front of her, the shadows of nearby streetlights making the shadows sharper around him. But no, that wasn't right. The shadows were growing sharper on their own. Izuku grasped her right index finger, twisting it counterclockwise until it snapped, leaving the skin twisted and dangling from where it was ripped too far. She cried out in pain, while he shivered in pleasure. Izuku took the already mangled finger and tightly pinched it between 2 of his fingers. He then took his other hand, and yanked the fingernail off. Hina was sobbing in pain. She wanted to get away from this monster. The monster in human skin noticed that she was crying, so he took his hands and started at the bottom of her eyes. He scratched down her cheeks, leaving angry red lines in their place. Not satisfied, he repeated the motion, again and again, until there were clawed lacerations deep in her cheeks. Her salty tears mixed with the blood, which undoubtedly made the wound sting more. Izuku took another 2 of her fingers and twisted them around each other, tying a broken knot of visceral gore. He pulled at her hair, making her scalp bleed, yet he was still unsatisfied with her pain. Her throat was hoarse from screaming, leaving only pathetic whimpering in its place. Izuku took the rest of her fingers and pulled off the rest of her fingernails. He stood up from his crouched position and harshly kicked her in the ribs. She fell onto her side, her face hitting the dirty pavement, which dug into her facial wounds. An idea struck him. He bent back down to dig out one of her eyes. She writhed on the ground as he disconnected the cord of her eye from her brain. He bit the eye in half and put it back in the socket. He did the same thing with the other eye. Next, he opened her mouth, tied her tongue in a knot, and ripped out each individual tooth, before taking the teeth and placing each one around the top of her head like a crown. The teeth in her head each dug into her scalp enough to draw blood. She was most likely dead by now, but if not, the pain was about to get worse. He reached his hand into her abdomen, scooping out her lungs from her rib cage. He placed them on either side of her, as he ripped out one of her ribs and ate it clean. He carefully picked out his prized heart, and giggled at the sight of his masterpiece. He unhinged his jaw and dropped the heart in. He felt his power swell, and he transformed into himself. His true form, Khanivore. He left the mangled shell of a body to rot. He was about the size that the late hero Death Arms was. His tail was sectioned off into 4 arms that came around to hang by his side. On his way back to the bar, anyone he came across was dead before they could realize. He didn't leave a trail, as that would be too obvious. Instead, he gathered the bodies, which totaled to about 5, and sat them in a circle with their backs leaning against one another. He got back to the bar and opened the door. He stood in the empty room for a moment, letting himself relax, before going off to his own room to go to bed after the long day he's had. Tsukachi rubbed his head tiredly. He wished his intern were here. But alas, it was Midoriya's day off, because of city timing. He debated calling the kid in. He's more than proved himself. But no, he wasn't going to drag him into this sitcho. All Might didn't seem to like him. Usually, that would set off a ton of red flags, but every background check came up clear, if a little worrying, with the way the kid had been treated by his peers. Unfortunately, it was in the past, and he discussed it with Midoriya, but the kid didn't want to press charges. He was so soft-hearted sometimes. Currently, he was arranging 2 hero teams to commence the raid on the villain's suspected hideouts. There was one, a bar, that they observed from afar. This was a pretty certain location, but the other one was iffy. The other one had only showed up because one of the hero students, Yaoyorozu, put a tracker on one of the Namus at the training camp. It led to a warehouse in central Kamino, whereas the bar was on the edge of Kamino. The bar was the likely place where the 2 kidnapped hero students were taken, so All Might was going to be on that team. Tsukachi separated the teams to whose quirk would be the best fit for each part of the mission. There was no news so far on the Soul Stealer. He's been quiet ever since. Detective. The Soul Stealer struck again. Never mind. He rounded on the startled officer and motioned for the man to lead him to the scene. What he found was sickening. It was a high school girl, her features barely recognizable. Her mouth was missing all her teeth, and there was no questioning their location. A formation of teeth, shaping into a crown, was digging into her head, which was stained with blood. Her tongue was tied into a knot, as were a few of her fingers. Her eyes were what made the whole thing worse than it already was. Her eyes were dug out of her head with a fingernail. Then they were bit in half and put back inside the socket. According to sample reports, this was all done while the girl was still alive. Her heart was missing, which was the telltale sign of the Soul Stealer. Tsukachi willed himself to focus back on the missing hero students, but was unable to as they found 5 more bodies about a block away. They were leaning against each other, their backs supporting each other. All of their hearts were missing. They couldn't ignore this monstrosity. It was the next afternoon that all the pieces of Izuku's plan fell into place. He showed up to work that day and helped with any backup that Tsukachi was dealing with because of the current case. There was no lingering suspicion about his identity, which means the surviving hero students didn't happen to define any of his distinguishing features. It was late afternoon by now, and Izuku was still at the office when the first hero team was sent out. Everyone's belongings were out of the hideout by mid-morning, so all it would take is themselves when Sid eventually hit the fan. He had twice make a copy of him to be stationed at the bar with them. It was his pitch-black persona, the one that was at the USJ. To be completely honest, he was nervous. All plans have a high chance of failing at first contact. He didn't want as many sleepless nights worth of the planning to be thrown out the window so easily. So, when everyone else had left the building, he left too, and followed them out into Kamino. He messaged Shoto, looking for an update, and he said that the press conference was starting. Izuku didn't bother watching it. He had more important things to worry about. He took the train to Kamino and got off at the closest stop to the warehouse. He could see police cars lined up everywhere. Conveniently, Tsukachi forgot something and Izuku decided to bring it to him as his reasoning for going out and into the soon-to-be war zone. A team of heroes was to be at the bar, but Tsukachi had gone to the warehouse location. He heard a loud boom coming from the direction of the bar and assumed that it was All Might making his entrance to their hideout. He made his way to Tsukachi to give him the file he forgot. Tsukachi was worried out of his mind apparently, both about the location of the file and the fact that Izuku was with him. And he correctly guessed that Sit was about to hit the fan, so he instructed Izuku to get out of there. He went in the direction that Tsukachi was hoping for, but instead of leaving, he merely circled the block and came around to the rear of the warehouse. That's where he found the 5 hero students. He could pick out all 5 of them too. Yaoyorozu Momo, Tsuyu Asui, Kirishima Ijiru, Bakugo Katsuki, and surprisingly, Ada Tenya. It seemed that Izuku hadn't trained him nearly as much as he thought he did. This threw a wrench in the plans though. He never thought to factor in the sheer stupidity of hero students. He texted both Shoto and Hitoshi in their group chat to let them know so they could plan accordingly. Welp, time to go introduce himself. Hi there. All 5 hero students jumped about 2 feet in the air. They whipped around and saw a short, green-haired boy who had silently snuck up behind them. Bakugo glowered at him. Deku. The boy's face lit up. Kakin. Bakugo's face was alight with suspicion. The F are you doing here? What am I doing here? What are you doing here? I asked you first, dumbass. But that's not fair. I found you here. That's too effing bad, cause I ain't answering you till we know why you're here. Izuku's shoulders slumped. Fine. I'm an intern at the police department. Bakugo blinked. Oh. Apparently he wasn't expecting that answer. Or, more reasonably, he was expecting the opposite, which was that he was a villain trying to stop them. A huge explosion crashed around them, making the hero students scramble in a comedic huddle. Izuku smirked as his form slid into the shadows, disappearing before any of them could notice. This wasn't his place to act, and All for One never said he was revealing himself. It messed up his plan entirely. He growled under his breath, watching the sitcho of a fight while he was a good distance away on the rooftop of some random warehouse. All Might was now permanently out of commission. While that made him technically an easy target, he would be surrounded by UA personnel. And that was the problem. Izuku was about to go find Shoto when he heard a nearby scuffle, not nearly as big as the fight. He looked down from his perch and peered down into the alleyway beneath. Surprisingly enough, Katsuki had gotten into a fight with Izuku's own copy, and it looked like his clone was losing. He silently jumped down from the roof, landing a fair distance behind Katsuki. "Taken, what are you doing?" Katsuki glanced behind him. However brief the look was, it was enough for the clone to jump back and get away. "Oops," Izuku blurted. Katsuki turned around and stalked toward him, furious. "Oi, shithead, next time don't effin' ask what I'm doing in the middle of fighting a goddamn villain." Izuku instinctively shrunk away, and then grimaced. "And that's the other thing." He looked at Katsuki, who'd apparently been talking this whole time. "Huh," he said. Katsuki pointed an accusatory finger at Izuku. "What the hell is up with you growing a backbone lately?" That's what this was about. Izuku grew angry. "Why the hell would you want to know?" He stepped forward as Katsuki stepped back. "You think I wouldn't have grown a backbone years ago had you not boosted your own inferiority complex by constantly lording over me? The quirkless Deku who wouldn't live up to anything. That stopped working years ago when I realized what your deal was." Izuku needed to get that out of his system apparently. Katsuki looked stunned, and didn't even try to deny the jab, knowing that what he said was true. Izuku pinched the bridge off his nose, unknowingly mimicking Tsukachi. "What I'm saying is that I'm done with your bullshit, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my day dealing with this." He turned around and walked away, not giving Katsuki the chance to speak. Earlier, with Hitoshi and Shoto, they got a text in the group chat from Izuku. "Today 6:32 p.m. Gremlin Bean, hero students have f'd up the plan to come and rescue you, just an FYI." Hitoshi blinked and hesitatingly stopped to think for a moment before responding. "I begs, do they not know about Shoto, then?" Gremlin Bean, "No. Gremlin Bean, we haven't released the video yet." Zuko Light, "Ah, that makes sense." Zuko Light, "I wanna set them on fire." I begs, don't worry, you'll get your chance." Hitoshi gave a laugh under his breath, though it seemed Shoto heard it because he cracked a smile. They both put their phones away, and Hitoshi went back over to the chairs and had Shoto tie him back up. Before Shoto has the chance to walk back over, Hitoshi managed to mutter something under his breath. Shoto turned back around and shot Hitoshi a questioning look. There was a crooked smile on his face as he said, "I said, you're pretty kinky, shoo, tying me up like this." Shoto's hair lit on fire. It was just a small flame, but it took attention off his wildly blushing face. There was a dash of pink on Hitoshi's face as well. He himself couldn't believe he had said that. That small dash of pink turned into bright scarlet when Shoto responded, "Maybe I am, Toshi. After all, you look so good when tied up like this." "Alright lovebirds, save it for later. We got some heroes on our tail." Izuku was right, Shoto thought, as the hero students were loudly devising a plan to rescue them both. "That's too bad," he supposed. He jumped up and balanced onto the chain link fence his former friends were hiding behind. "You guys shouldn't be here." They startled, and Kirishima hit his head on the fence, making Shoto laugh. They all turned to look at him, and he stood on the fence, still balanced. "Oi, icy hot, where the F is the zombie?" Shoto looked over at Bakugo, and had his head to the side. "What does this have to do with Shinsu?" The students tensed. Everyone at school knew that Todoroki and Shinsu were on a first-name basis. What had happened? Todoroki lifted his right hand, formed a gun with his pointer finger and thumb, and lifted it up to point at them. "Pow," he said in a deadpan. "Hi." He put his right hand down, and lifted up his left. Shoto smiled something wicked, and it was something that they'd never seen on his face before. It was Asui who figured it out first. "Guys, run." Pow. The world lit up in flames. He was angry, and he felt the need to take it out on someone. There were so many heroes on site, he found the perfect target. A lone hero, doing patrols in other parts of the city while the bigger heroes dealt with the villains. It was a smaller hero, the Fly. He didn't care who it was. Before the man had time to gauge the situation, Izuku slammed his palm into his face, slamming him to the ground and simultaneously breaking the man's nose. The hero groaned in pain, but still tried to get up and fend off his attacker. It was commendable, yet futile. Izuku's muscles rippled, and he grew in size as he attacked the man. The hero most definitely had a concussion from the blow. But even if he didn't, then he certainly did when Izuku kept landing punch after punch onto the man's head. The Fly wasn't a hero for nothing, and he just kept getting back up. Izuku couldn't think straight, and was hell-bent on causing more pain. He eventually tackled the man, who was so beat up that he was unrecognizable. He gripped both hands on the man's neck, slowly asphyxiating him. The hero struggled in his grip, eyes open to stare at his attacker. "Why, you're just a child." Izuku's face morphed, then. He became more monstrous. His teeth gleamed under the streetlight, and he relished in the fear radiating from the hero, as he realized that this was no child in front of him, but a monster in human skin. Izuku cracked a fanged smile. "Child. No, I steal souls." His mouth opened slowly, revealing rows upon rows of teeth. A laugh escaped the creature's maw, as he bit down on the hero's head. Hitoshi smiled to himself as he was finally rescued by the heroes. He could hear the explosion caused by Shoto, and he could see the ambulances swooping in after the flames died down. He refrained from talking, and no one batted an eye. Only because he had the forethought to ask Shigaraki to put a muzzle on him. The man had done so hesitantly. Hitoshi had reassured the man, claiming that he was used to the feeling. Funnily enough, that made the man's mood worse. It made sense that the villains would muzzle him. It's the way his quirk worked. There were paramedics everywhere, running around in the chaos of everything happening at once. Eventually, they got around to questioning him. He rubbed where the edges of the muzzle dug into his skin, and he looked at the faces of those questioning him. He let tears fall as he grit his teeth and spat out, "That effing traitor." He clenched his eyes shut and struggled to wipe the tears out of his eyes. He hiccuped, but went on, "He's with them now. The leak. He caused the explosion." The detective, Tsukachi, took a few steps backwards and into another officer. All the adults around him were startled. The detective wiped sweat off his brow before affirming what Hitoshi said. He's telling the truth. The weight of what he said suddenly bore down on the crowd like a sack of bricks. Izuku skipped joyously on his way back home, where he warmly greeted his mom and went to his room. He sat down at his desk and opened his computer. Checking the news, he saw the fight between All Might and All for One was all over it. He smiled bitterly. Why did All for One have to F this up? Oh well, now he just needed to work around it. Toru walked through the dark alleys of Musutafu, a knife in her hand. She thought about her supposed friends. They forgot about her. Well, they won't forget about her anymore. Toga was very nice to her, and she even gave Toru some knives to use. Why knives? Because they were the most physical, and she needed to be seen. Shishida-san, said hero student, turned around to look at the person who said his name. But as he turned around, no one was there. He could smell them though, there was the smell of nerves. Why were they hiding from him? It kind of hurt his feelings. Yes, there's no need to be scared of my looks, I know my quirk looks scary. He was training to be a hero after all. He often practiced ways to calm a civilian down. Me, scared. He whipped his head around to where the voice piped up behind him. Again, no one. Was this some sort of trick? Why would I be scared of a hero student? The voice came from the alley directly to his right. He stepped into it, only to find a pair of clothing. How do I know who you are? Hero students are supposed to be seen, after all. This person was leading him in circles. He spun around, seeing nothing. Was he going crazy? He relied on his senses. The person was right in front of him. Then why can't I be seen? His eyes caught onto something. A reflection of light. He didn't have time to think on it before he was blinded and tackled to the ground. There was someone on top of him. Someone invisible. Oh, that's why he couldn't see them. Still, he started to panic as a knife was held to his throat. The person leaned down to whisper in Shishida's ear, "Why should you be seen if I can't?" Toru stabbed down into the hero student's neck. She wrote her name on the alley wall. Night Stalker. Izuku met up with Shoto and Hitoshi at their new hideout, a few days after the raid. They were in private company, as it was just the three of them. He hugged them both tightly. He took both boys' hands and rubbed his face on them. "Zuku, you're acting like a cat again," Hitoshi pointed out. Izuku merely started purring, basically stating that he didn't care. He took Hitoshi's face in his hands. "You did so good in your acting. I almost believed you." Hitoshi's blush was visible, even as the green-haired boy moved on to Shoto. With Shoto's face in his hands, "You caused so much chaos. It was amazing." He let go of the half-and-half boy's face, and beamed as both boys' faces were red. "I had fun," Shoto said. Izuku beamed. The next day, Izuku went to school. It was chaos, and Izuku reveled in it. The teacher had to announce the death of Hina. He couldn't keep the smile off his face when they were told that it was the Soul Stealer. During one of his breaks, he made his way to the art room. And lo and behold, the art teacher was at his desk. He smiled one of his purest smiles. "Tamura-sensei." "Hi." The man looked up from what he was doing, only to be greeted by the monster in human skin, who was giving big doe eyes and an innocent smile. The man paled, but responded, "Midoriya." Izuku chirped, "I just wanted to stop by and say hi." A few seconds ticked by. "Okay, bye." He turned around and walked right back out of the classroom, leaving behind Tamura, who had to keep himself from dry heaving in fear, especially in front of a bunch of students. Soon enough, word had spread that the art teacher and Midoriya knew each other, and that the former was afraid of the latter. It honestly made Izuku's day. As he walked home from school, he could sense he was being followed, so he turned into an alley and essentially cornered himself. He turned around to see a random kid who had a CY aura to him. "Would you look at that, it's the mysterious boy wonder." The boy obviously attempted to get a reaction out of Izuku, but he was to be disappointed. The boy started ranting, something about how Izuku was stealing all the attention and glory to the school. He didn't really pay attention to the boy until the boy got so frustrated that he took a swing at Izuku's head. Izuku caught the fist in one hand, and his face was void of any expression. The boy sputtered, "Why, you shouldn't have been able to catch that." Izuku responded, "But I did." He shifted his stance ever so slightly. "Now, are you going to tell me why you're really here? Or are you going to continue wasting my time?" The kid's face practically turned purple as he seemingly activated his quirk, which ... Turns out it takes the breath from a person's lungs. Too bad for the kid. Izuku could function just fine without breathing for a minute or two. "You should be dead any minute now, and then my body count will be 6. Izuku would have scoffed if he could. Instead, he took advantage of the fact that the kid had completely let his guard down when his quirk activated, leaving him wide open to Izuku going up to him and grabbing him by the throat. As he did that, his breath returned to his lungs, and he stared down at the petrified boy. I didn't know there were 2 serial killers at our school. How fun. The boy strained in his grip. T2. Who's the other one? Izuku put his hand over his heart and feigned hurt. I thought it'd be obvious. It's me, silly. The boy struggled harder in his grip, and his eyes were blown wide. He giggled and let go of the kid's neck, and the said kid just sat there and stared up at Izuku in horror. What's your body count? A wide, wicked smile took over Izuku's face, which made the boy shrink back. I'm not sure, but I think it's somewhere in the mid-70 range. 70, the boy whimpered. 70, Izuku affirmed. Sit, I F it up, said the boy. Izuku agreed, but decided to go out on a limb for the dude. He held out his hand and said, how about this, do you have a name? The boy looked at him like he was crazy. Takahira Hiroto. Do you know my name? Said Takahira. Izuku blinked, before laughing. Yes, thank you. But no, I meant your villain name. A look of realization dawned on Takahira's face. Oh, well, I've heard some people call me the Snatcher. At Izuku's blank look, he elaborated, like, snatching the breath out of someone. Izuku was slightly impressed, because that was a stupid name. That's a kind of stupid name, no offense. The boy looked indignant. Well, the public is stupid. If it were my choice, I'd want to be called Asphyxiator. Izuku snorted. That made the boy even more irritated. Oh yeah. Well, what's your name, huh? Izuku had been waiting for this. They gave me a badass name, in my opinion. He paused, just to check if he had Takahira's attention. But I also devised my name myself. He willed the shadows of the alley into his possession, making them grow and transform. His eyes changed from green to purple as he said to the boy, 70-ish kills. I have a reputation, and they still don't know who I am. A wicked smile formed on his face. I am the Soul Stealer, Quirkless. He let go of his hold on the shadows, and they settled back down to where they were. His eyes turned back to green, and he let his smile fall off his face. Takahira was actually shivering in terror, faced with the fact that he attempted to kill the Soul Stealer. That made him stop and think for a second. So, Hina-san. Izuku shrugged. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They just stared at each other for a moment. Cool. Bye, said Izuku. Takahira scrambled up, gave a hasty but low bow before hightailing out of there. Aizawa was sick of this sit. He figured he shouldn't be surprised that one of his turned out to be the traitor. It was a touchy subject that none of them liked to talk about. It was odd that he copped out here though. There were so many of his in cans that were dead or injured from that leak. Maybe it's time he retires. But no, not when he's so close to finding the monster who took all of them from him. That's why he expels people, so they don't have to die needlessly like Aburo. Aizawa froze in that train of thought. He shook his head. Don't need his mind going down that rabbit hole. Sue him. They never gave him time to mourn. But still, there was something. There was something he was forgetting. Hagakure was curled up in her room at the base, still mostly inconsolable because of the fact that it was so easy for her former friends to forget her. It was a suffocating feeling, and she hated it. Toga could only do so much to console her, though her presence has helped considerably. How could they forget her so easily? Weren't they her friends? She considered them close, but now, it was like she never even knew them. She screamed into her pillow, letting the endless stream of tears fall, soaking her pillow. His blood was out of control. He dug his nails into his bedroom desk, creating dents in the wood. It was currently evening, and the sun was almost down. He pulled on a jacket and made his way out of his house. Izuku took a lesser-known path to the heart of Misutafu. There, in a back alley, he ran into one of his coworkers at the police station. Aikta Ren. Aikta was also working on his case. Too bad for him. Before he could properly greet Izuku, he was slammed into the wall of a building with a hand covering his mouth to prevent noise. Midoriya. Izuku was laughing maniacally at such a wonderful coincidence. It was scaring Aikta. Other than his mouth being covered, and the slight weight holding him to the wall, Aikta wasn't being restrained. He raised his hand and took the other's hand off his mouth. He had a worried look on his face. Midoriya, are you okay? 2 sharp eyes snapped to him, and a manic grin stayed in his face. Aikta-san. I'm fine. His voice dropped an octave, as his mouth shaped into a scowl. It's yourself you should be worried about. Aikta had no time to process this comment as his head was slammed into brick. Sit. He probably got a concussion from that. The man blearily looked up at the wickedly smiling face of his coworker, who leaned down so that he was face to face with him. Aikta-san, I appreciate your dutiful work on my case. The man was confused. Your case? We don't have a case for you. Izuku started giggling. Oh, but that's where you're wrong. Aikta was disturbed. Midoriya has never been this expressive, with such a wide range of emotions. It was a sign of some bad things that had to do with his mental state. There was also a question bugging him at the back of his mind. What's your case? All movement stopped. Midoriya sounded almost delicate in his next words. My case. He took Aikta's wrist and bit down suddenly, making the man hiss in pain. Izuku lapped up the blood like he was dying of thirst. The hand not holding the wrist was using Aikta's face as leverage. Once he was done with his brief snack, Izuku had his lips and made eye contact with Aikta. I've been right under your noses this whole time, and you still know nothing about me. He smiled wide, showing off his bloody teeth that seemed sharper than what was normal. I'm Quirkless, after all. The man froze in pure terror. The notorious supervillain, his coworker. All this time, angry, vengeful tears slid down Aizawa's face. You monster. Killing all those innocent people. And for what? Fun. Izuku's eyes were manic as he stared at the man in glee. Oh yes, you should have seen their faces. They were so helpless and scared, and they knew there was no way out of it. He leaned down to whisper in Aizawa's ear, and they make such great food. I couldn't have made it any better. Aizawa recoiled, not actually expecting that to be the answer. Izuku shifted, his form morphing into something monstrous. If Aizawa had any doubts about his identity, they were gone when he transformed. His claws slashed at the man's chest, leaving 3 huge gashes. Quirklash had the blood of his talons, savoring the taste. Aizawa grasped at his jacket in pain, ripping off pieces of it to try and staunch his wounds. It was no use. There was blood flowing everywhere. He started to hyperventilate. But in a moment of desperate hope, Aizawa reached into his pocket and grabbed his walkie-talkie. He buzzed in, Mayday, Mayday, Quirklash is here, in Misutafu, send emergency forces. The device was knocked from his hands by a livid Quirklash, who crushed the device under his foot. Unbeknownst to both of them, the tracking device was still on. Mayday, Mayday, Quirklash is here, in Misutafu, send emergency fo. Aizawa's voice cut off abruptly. Tsukachi and Aizawa had just been in his office discussing the safety of the students at UA. Now they were running around the office, gathering every officer and hero they could find on short notice, and hightailing out of there to the location of the walkie-talkie. The tracking was still on, but the audio was dead. The scene they found was terrifying. Aizawa had 3 gashes in his chest and was bleeding out. Yet no one went over to help them, because of the massive creature, at least 9 feet tall, standing over him. The group of about 60 people give or take could only watch in horror as the creature tore open the man's chest cavity, plucked the heart right out of Aizawa's chest, swallowed it whole, and grew by about 3 feet. Yes, this was definitely the Soul Stealer, in the flesh. The beast turned around to face them, and showed off all their rows of teeth by roaring at them. Well, detective. Fancy meeting you here. The beast spoke, but its mouth wasn't moving. He shook his head. That's not important. He answered with the first question that popped in his mind. Why are you doing all of this? The creature pawed at the ground, laughter reminiscent of a hyena. Then, they looked Tsukachi straight in the eye. Why? Because it's so fun to torment these bugs underneath my feet. They're all so helpless, why not savor the fear? There was pure disgust on the detective's face, and he motioned those behind him to get in position. The Soul Stealer caught on, and turned and leaped onto the rooftops, prompting some of the flight-based heroes to go after him, namely, Hawks. The winged hero was definitely skilled, as was the Soul Stealer, yet neither could get the upper hand on each other. There were feathers flying everywhere, each as sharp as one of Quirklash's talons. Quirklash had detailed analysis on many heroes, Hawks included, which is why he knew to avoid the feathers flying at him. As agile as he was, there was no avoiding some of the thin cuts the feathers made. It didn't matter though, considering those cuts healed instantly. It hurt, however. The 2 of them fought among the rooftops as if it were a dance, one lunging at the other only for them to dodge. Hawks bore a few scratches from where he got unlucky. Hawks gritted his teeth. It had been a while since he'd faced someone of this caliber. He was getting exhausted, yet this thing kept healing. Was it a Namu like the others? No, this thing was too sentient to be a Namu. Also, there was no exposed brain. No, this fell off. The creature slowed down at the top of one of the skyscrapers in downtown Misutafu. They seemed to be at an impasse. That is, until the creature doubled in size. Now Hawks was the one evading blow after blow. The creature kept chasing after him, destroying parts of buildings in the process. Finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the creature managed to one-up him, creating a large gash in his back, where his wings tend to grow back. The sirens were growing loud, with many police officers rushing to the scene. The creature grabbed him, before doing something, but he was too delirious to figure out what it was. Before he passed out, it was already pitch black in his vision. The news was everywhere. There was no way anyone could miss it, not even the League of Villains. Which is why, after turning the TV off, Dabai turned to face said villain, and asked, "So what is the deal with the knocked-out hero in one of our chairs?" Izuku laughed nervously, rubbing his hand on his head. The opportunity was right there. Now I can, get information out of him. Dabai rolled his eyes, easily detecting the lie. He threw his hands up in the air. Fine, whatever, just don't let it mess anything up, he said as he turned around and walked back to his room. Having already treated the man's wounds, he transformed into a smaller, house cat-like version of himself, and sat on the tied-up man's lap. Hawks slowly came to with a burning pain in his back. There was a weight on his lap, and blearily, he looked down to see a house cat. No, it wasn't a house cat. It was the creature who kidnapped him. He attempted to move, but his restraints kept him from doing so. Get off me, dude. No, Hawk stopped trying to move. The creature talked. Well, it had talked earlier. Despite what it said, the creature hopped off the hero's lap. Though in the next moment, Hawks wished it hadn't gotten off his lap, because the creature grew more to the size it was when the team had found it. This meant that it was well over his own height standing up. Hawks actually started panicking, because there was something keeping his feathers from growing back, and it most definitely had something to do with the precarious situation that he found himself in. What do you want from me? Questioned Hawks. The creature, seemingly in response, moved like liquid shadow, coming face to face with the winged hero. You're here because I want you to join us, Takami Keigo. Hawks jerked back, which caused the pain in back to flare up to an agonizing degree, also causing him to fall backwards in his chair, which did not help his back in the slightest. Hawks hissed in pain, and shakily replied, Why, the hell, would I join villains like you? The creature scoffed, Need I bring up everything the Hero Commission has done to you? Somehow, there was a smile on the creature's face. It was a wicked and cruel-looking thing, and it made Hawks gulp. Why would you want to continue to help the people who destroyed who you were in the first place? Hawks shrank back. They don't do that much, he murmured. The creature's jaws suddenly snapped at him, just missing his nose by an inch. Liar. Hawks was breathing heavily, scared for his life. The creature circled his chair in a predatory manner. The Hero Commission is nothing but a pack of greedy, power-hungry weaklings. It stopped pacing, and turned to look at the downed hero, and you would do well to remember that. The creature finally backed away, but not before yelling. Dabai. Yes, sir. A new voice spoke up from the shadows. The creature went somewhere else, leaving Hawks with a heavily scarred man with many piercings. The man cracked his knuckles and approached Hawks, smiling every bit of the way. Ashido Mina missed her friend. There was something odd happening around here. Mina had asked about the whereabouts of her best friend, Hagakure Toru, yet no one seemed to acknowledge that she was even missing. Mina thought she was kidnapped too. There was only one person she thought would know something. Shinsu. Said boy looked up at his name, only to see Mina standing in front of his desk. Though being the extrovert she was, Shinsu made her nervous. Could we talk? She looked around at the classroom they were in private. Shinsu nodded his head, and they went to a stairway alcove that was out of the way. Shinsu started talking first. What did you need, Ashido-san? Mina stopped him right there. Please, call me Mina. Shinsu nodded, then, call me Hitoshi. All my friends do. Mina sat down next to Hitoshi. I hate to bring up bad memories, but what happened when you were taken? Was Toru there too? She bent her head down, and attempted to keep her tears from falling. Shinsu had a wide-eyed look on his face. Actually, yeah, she was there. Mina's head shot up, shock written all over her face. Hitoshi saw her look and scoffed. I hate to tell you this, Mina, but Hagakure is a villain now. And just like that, Mina's hope shattered, and instead was replaced by something bitter. Mina laughed, which surprised Hitoshi. It was a bitter laugh, he realized, and he went to touch her shoulder, only for her to jerk back enough for him to see the tears streaming down her face. She waved her hands in front of her, in a sort of giving up motion. I guess that's it then, all of my classmates are becoming villains. What's next? You. Me. Hitoshi had no answer for that. Even so, he swiftly grabbed her in a hug before she could do anything rash. Her shoulders drooped, and she clutched him like a lifeline, crying her heart out for her best friend. It was later in the evening, and Toru held the burner phone in her hand, silently debating whether she should do it. Hitoshi had told Mina about her, and while she doesn't blame him, given the situation, she wishes that she could have been the one to tell Mina. It doesn't matter now. She picked up the phone. Hello, Mina. She quickly held the phone away from her ear just as a loud, screaming Mina came through from the other side. Toru made a placating gesture to thin air. Calm down, Mina. I promise I'm here. Hitoshi said you're a villain now. The relieved smile on her face dimmed ever so slightly. Yes, it's true. I'm sore. I want to join you, Toru. Toru nearly dropped the phone in her hand. She fumbled it for a few moments before she held it back up to her ear. Why you what? Mina, what brought this on? There was silence on the other end. And then, you're my best friend, Toru, and I can't live without you. Mina cleared her throat over the phone. I know it sounds cheesy, but I don't care about this hero sit if I can't be with you. There were tears streaming down Toru's face, because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She'd never expected anyone to accept her after becoming a villain. Hell, she never expected to be remembered. But here was living proof, in her best friend. Fine, where are you? Toru asked her. Mina gave her coordinates, which were to an abandoned warehouse. Kurogiri opened his portal, and Mina stepped through to see Toru, limply holding a phone by her side. Her body language gave away her shock at the situation. Before she could comprehend it, Mina rushed toward her and enveloped her in a bone-crushing hug. Both girls' tears mixed together as they both cried for their best friend. It was Toru who let go first. You really mean it? You'll join us. Mina gave a wholehearted nod, with no deceit in her body language. Fantastic, a monotone voice spoke up behind the two. Both girls whipped around to find Todoroki with a completely blank expression on his face. Mina let out a loud laugh and held up her hand. Todoroki, my man, gimme 5. Todoroki just stared at her, not understanding what he was supposed to do. Mina stood there for a moment longer, before waving it off. That's fine, dude. I'll have to teach you that later. They headed back to the temporary base, and Mina was introduced to everyone. Toga took a liking to her, just as she did with Toru. Both girls were inseparable for the rest of the night. You couldn't get one without the other. They stayed on the dilapidated couch for the remainder of the night, curled up against each other. And that's how Izuku found them. He thought it was rather cute of them. Sitting on the table in front of the couch, he fidgeted with his hands until they woke up. Izuku decided to speed up the process. Ashido Mina. Said girl shot up at the sound of her name, causing Toru to wake up as well. Mina looked at the boy sitting on the table. He looked familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Izuku gave a small smirk. Let me guess, I look familiar. Mina was obviously about to say that exact phrase, because her mouth was open, but she shut it immediately after. Gracefully, he stood up, and without looking at Mina, said, You've most likely looked through Shoto or Hitoshi's photos and seen me in them. He turned around to stare at the pink-haired girl. I'm their best friend. Mina looked confused, but I thought you all had a falling out. Who says we did? Mina recognized that voice and whipped her head around to stare at the figure in the doorway. It was Hitoshi, in the flesh. Mina seemed at a loss for words. Hitoshi. Why you're a villain too. Her face then dawned on recognition. You're a mole. Hitoshi made a finger gun at her. Got it in one. Cupcake. She scrunched her eyebrows. Cupcake. What? Toru put a hand on her shoulder. He calls everyone that. Don't worry about it. Izuku snapped his fingers to get their attention. Come to think of it, maybe you have met me, briefly. Mina focused her attention on him, wondering what he meant. Izuku smiled. I was at the USJ, making my unofficial debut. Mina merely raised her eyebrows, before waving it off. It doesn't matter. Izuku's shoulders dropped, looking slightly disappointed. He took a deep breath. Whatever then. Apparently, Hitoshi had a request for Izuku. The request was mostly just to kill someone in front of him, in the most brutal way Izuku could think of. So they found a victim. It wasn't anyone special, merely an office worker whom no one would miss for a while. It was the middle of the night, during the witching hour, that the two of them snuck into the man's apartment. There were no lights on whatsoever, so Hitoshi was stumbling in the dark, while Izuku was navigating just fine. They found the man sleeping in his bed, not having stirred even with the ruckus that Hitoshi made. Izuku swiftly grabbed the man by his neck, holding him in a chokehold and keeping him from screaming. Hitoshi meanwhile had turned on the lights in the room. Izuku turned his head to Hitoshi, gesturing for him to make the first move. He walked towards the man Izuku was holding, and punched him in the face, hard. This action caused the man to lose a tooth as he choked on blood. Izuku smiled in a wide, wicked way that made Hitoshi's face heat up. Izuku noticed, and the smile went wider. He turned to the man, covered his mouth with his hand, and took off the chokehold of the man. He then proceeded to dive down and bite into the man's neck. There were slurping noises made by Izuku that did nothing to help Hitoshi's growing problem. When Izuku had finally stopped slurping, the man had gone slack, giving him the ability to take his hand off the man's mouth. He turned back to look at Hitoshi and caught a whiff of the smell. He chuckled, which garnered Hitoshi's attention. Izuku stepped forward, closer to Hitoshi, who backed up slightly, hitting the wall behind him. Izuku kept advancing, a smile full of bloody teeth, and a face Hitoshi couldn't help but look at. May I? Izuku asked, and Hitoshi hastily nodded. Izuku grabbed Hitoshi by the shirt and pulled him towards him. Izuku started feeling him up, and Hitoshi was honestly all for it. Hitoshi managed to grab Izuku's face with his two hands and pull them into a kiss. While Izuku was doing his thing with Hitoshi, the lavender-haired boy himself felt like he was floating on a cloud. He gasped for air, yet Izuku stayed close to his face, eyeing his lips with a long forked tongue that made Hitoshi shudder. What about Shoto? Hitoshi breathily asked. Izuku just kept eyeing his face. He's always with us, of course. He can be with us for this too. This comment relaxed Hitoshi, who was worried about it in the back of his mind. Hitoshi involuntarily jutted his hips forward, making him give out an embarrassing noise that turned his face scarlet. Izuku merely purred alluringly in response, making Hitoshi's blood pressure skyrocket. The action prompted Hitoshi to do it again, and Izuku was prepared for it this time. Izuku reciprocated, which caused both of them to groan. Suddenly, Izuku pulled away and went over to the unconscious soon-to-be-dead man. He ripped into the man's chest cavity like it was made of thin paper. He reached for the heart of the man, picked it up, and put it in front of Hitoshi's face. Go on, he prompted Hitoshi, who was starting to look a little nervous, even though it was his idea to begin with. Hitoshi slowly lifted it up to his mouth, and after a slight hesitation, he took a solid bite out of the heart. He honestly took it pretty well, only slightly gagging on it, before eventually swallowing. Hitoshi wiped the excess blood off his mouth, tasting the heart again. Honestly, not the worst thing I've ever tasted. Izuku beamed a smile that lit up the room, even though it was obvious that the heart didn't taste nearly as good as Izuku made it out to seem. The green-haired boy turned around and continued to brutalize his victim. He took both hands to the man's face and unhinged the man's jaw with his bare hands, before pulling the upper and lower jaw to opposite sides. He sliced the flesh to ribbons, and ate each rib clean, leaving visible bite marks in the bone. Izuku bent the victim's limbs in unnatural directions, as well as letting Hitoshi crush his spinal cord to dust, just as he had done with Ajuru. Hitoshi enjoyed the feeling of bone giving way under his foot, as shown in the way he cracked most of the victim's vertebrae. Hitoshi touched Izuku's shoulder when he was finished and was happy with the amount of gore displayed. Izuku had blood all over his hands and face, while Hitoshi had blood all over his shoes and a little bit on his mouth. They went back to the hideout, properly covering their tracks. When they got there, they were greeted by Shoto, who was sitting on one of the dilapidated couches, watching TV with Spinner. They pulled Shoto from his spot to talk in private. When it was just the three of them, Hitoshi started out by wiping his mouth with his index finger, drawing the excess blood from it and wiping it on Shoto's nose. "Congratulations, we've formed a gang, and you're now in it." Izuku giggled behind them, amused at Hitoshi's way of asking Shoto out. Unfortunately, Shoto was a little too dense for his flirting, so Izuku made to step in. However, his help wasn't needed. Shoto had a confused look on his face. "Aren't we villains though? Why would we be in a gang?" Hitoshi patted his head affectionately, before clarifying. "No, dummy." He leaned his head down to whisper in Shoto's ear, well aware that Izuku could still hear them. "It means we're all boyfriends now, if that's what you want." He leaned back upright as Izuku was about to open his mouth. Shoto, face scarlet, very excitedly nodded his head, making eye contact with both of them. Yes, he gave a bright smile. That would be wonderful. Despite his small stature, Izuku managed to lift the both of them up, one boy in each arm. He was laughing out loud. He looked up to his left, where Hitoshi was, and said, "You're awful at flirting, just so you know." The lavender-haired boy looked playfully indignant. "I'm not awful at flirting. Candy cane over there just doesn't get my jokes." Both boys looked over at Shoto, who matched Hitoshi's expression. "I do get your jokes." He looked down bashfully, most of the time. "Don't worry," said Izuku, "I'll tell you some jokes later. They'll involve cats." Both boys smiled. "Oi, lovebirds. Birdie's being stupid down here. Come help." Dabai's voice sounded from downstairs. He sounded exasperated, so Hawks was probably causing him gray hairs. Izuku stopped Hitoshi, "On the off chance that Hawks isn't convinced enough to join us, we don't want you to be seen with us, you're still our mole." Hitoshi nodded and went to sit down, but not before giving both Izuku and Shoto a kiss on the cheek. Izuku made it down the stairs first, having basically jumped, while Shoto just went down the stairs normally. The scene they stumbled upon was amusing. Despite being tied to a chair, Hawks was managing to scoot on his chin and knees across the floor to try and bite at Dabai's shoes. Izuku let out a light chuckle, giving away his presence to the two men. Hawks, having never seen Izuku normally, went wide-eyed. "You guys have a kid in here. He's like 11. A tick mark appeared on Izuku's forehead. "Oi. I'm not 11, I'm 16. Don't assume things about me." Hawks blinked dumbly. Oops. He looked around, locking eyes with Dabai, who just scowled. "So, what do I have to do to join this league of villains?" Izuku wore a wicked smile at that statement. He's not the one in charge right now." Hawks whipped his head around to look at the kid who spoke. Izuku held out his hands menacingly. "I want you." He stepped closer to Hawks, "to bring All Might to my feet." He bent down onto Hawks' level, just so I can devour his heart once and for all. Hawks was sweating, yet speechless. Izuku's smile was all teeth. "Wow, Birdie, how astute of you." He circled around the downed hero, like a predator stalking its prey. Or better yet, like the cat catching the canary. Think of it like this, Takami Keigo. You have two options. 1. He peered down at the hero's expression, looking for any sign of weakness. You die, right here, right now. The hero stiffened noticeably. Or, you complete this mission. I'm giving you, he nudged the winged hero with his foot. You fail to complete the mission. You die. He turned around and walked toward Shoto. "But if you succeed, you'll get to join us," he smirked, and turned his head over his shoulder to look at Hawks, "and you'll live." Izuku put his hand on the nape of Shoto's neck, leading him away from the remainder of the tension in the room. Izuku uttered, turning to Shoto. "That was nerve-wracking as hell." Shouting blinked, slightly shocked. "Is that what that was? You didn't seem nervous to me," he responded. Izuku gave a light laugh. "Thanks, Shu." He gave him a light peck on the lips without thinking. A blush appeared on his face when the realization hit. They walked back to their room, where Hitoshi was waiting for them. When they got there, the lavender-haired boy got up from where he was sitting on the couch. "So, how'd it go?" Shoto had a small smile on his face. Izuku threatened Hawks, pretty convincingly. He turned to said boy, who was fiddling with his hands. "Is what you said true?" The green-haired boy looked up at them, a confused expression on his face. "Which part?" Shoto went over and patted him on the head. "The part about killing All Might." Izuku looked down, and a small amount of tears filled his eyes. This alarmed the two boys, and as they tried to figure out what was wrong, Izuku spoke. "He's the one who crushed my dreams of being a hero." This took both boys by surprise. "Besides the obvious, is he one of the reasons you became a villain?" Hitoshi asked. Izuku nodded his head, hesitantly. Both Shoto and Hitoshi wrapped their arms around him, in a wordless offer of unconditional love and comfort. Tsukachi was at yet another crime scene. This one felt different, though. It had a different aura around it. It was a completely average man. An office worker with a quirk that could change the color of his eyes, nothing special. At first, it was your typical soul stealer case, except for the fact that it was indoors, as opposed to the usual alleyway. But then they found the man's missing heart only a few yards away, and a single bite taken out of it. It was highly unusual. It was a sympathizer kill. That was the only thing Tsukachi could think of. But the soul stealer has no compelling motive. It said so itself. It only kills for fun. But then again, it probably gains sustenance from the hearts it eats. Maybe that was its motive. The man's body was practically eviscerated. Not for lack of parts, but for how spread out the radius of viscera was. The investigation team was trying to pick out every piece of evidence they might have from this killer. They didn't get much except for the heart, which no one wanted to study, let alone touch. Tsukachi pinched the bridge of his nose in deep-set frustration. He wrote the report of the crime and put it in his folder to bring back to the office. Sometimes he hated his job. Golden antlers, glass animals. It took weeks, but finally, Hawks was returned to the heroes. He was very obviously tortured. There were burns all along his neck, starting at his collarbone and making their way up to the lobe of his ear. Along with that, there were lacerations on his back, as if he were whipped. There were also acid burns all over his face and wings. His wings were, for lack of better word, scarred. The heroes could see why he couldn't get out sooner. The villains had used acid to keep his wings from growing back. They were raw and featherless, and looked to be more painful than the rest of his wounds. He was comatose, so luckily he wasn't there to feel the pain. Unluckily, that meant that the pain inflicted on him was so bad, his brain had to shut down. He was transferred to emergency care, where it took him another week to recover enough to wake up. Understandably, he wouldn't talk about the extent of his experience, not that anyone could blame him. The second the hero woke up, he grabbed his throat gently in his hands. Doctors had seen bruises in the shape of handprints. At the gazes of the doctors, he looked down in pain and finally spoke up. One of the villains got off on choking me with his hands. It was he gripped his head, trapped in what seemed to be a flashback. How the doctors focused on the hero once more. How does someone enjoy these things? These awful things that do so much to hurt people. He heavily let go of his neck in defeat. The doctors of course couldn't answer that question, but that was all right. He didn't need them to. Yes, he admits that Todoroki had gone a little too far with the choking. But it was all a ploy to make his return believable. It was also strange. Hawks feels like he's seen the soul stealer somewhere before, but he couldn't place it. Well, he couldn't place it until the detective and his understudy came in for a report. It suddenly said for him, though he did his best not to stare. The notorious serial killer, the Soul Stealer, also known as the most fearsome supervillain in all of Japan, was sitting behind the lead detective of his own case like nothing was wrong. For a moment, he was speechless. The Soul Stealer has integrated himself so perfectly into the slices of his enemies, it makes him hide in plain sight. This could be his last chance to break free. He had to try, even if it got him killed. Even the sharp glance made toward him while the detective looked away wasn't going to deter him. Detective. He stopped, suddenly. The monster in human skin sitting in front of him had just held up a sign. It said, "Say something and I kill everybody in this building." They were in a general hospital. He'd been transferred here once he was in stable condition. He couldn't let all those innocent people die. He had the detective's attention now, and he had to act quickly. "I saw Todoroki Shoto there. He's the one who did this." He gestured to his neck, where the hand-shaped bruises were still very visible. His right eye twitched, indicating a truth. The man huffed a sigh. He seemed like such a sweet young man. To think, stooping to such levels. The detective turned to his understudy, Midoriya. "What do you think about this? You usually have a lot more to say." The boy, Midoriya, apparently, had small tears in his eyes, which alarmed both of the other men, for different reasons. "It's just," he started, "Shoto was one of my best friends, and..." The amount of tears grew, and to hear that he's become a villain. He started sobbing, with the detective awkwardly patting his shoulder, trying to calm him down. Hawks was impressed. There was no actual lie in his statement. And his name was Midoriya, that's good to know. It wasn't like he could call him Quirkless and not expect anything to come of that. The detective let Midoriya out of the room, and began to question Hawks. It took a while for him to open up, but eventually he recounted that the villains wanted him to kill Best Jeanist, or else he would die. Hawks saw that the man obviously registered the lie, and was quick to make amends. "And no, it's not what you think. I won't be the one killing him." His voice dropped to a mutter. "That's the Soul Stealer's job." Tsukachi didn't know why he was surprised at this point. The Soul Stealer was the most dangerous serial killer in Japan. They had to make a new rank for him, SS class. They didn't even do that with All for One. Tsukachi pinched the bridge of his nose. The stress was getting to him. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. Suddenly, he got a call. Answering it, he found that it was Sir Night-Eye, who needed him for backup on a Yakuza building. He bade Hawks goodbye and left his understudy with the hero. The two made eye contact for a few moments, before the green-haired boy lunged at Hawks, tackling him and holding his neck in a death grip. Midoriya snarled in the face of the winged hero, his face morphing into his more monstrous self. "You idiot." Hawks was breathing heavily, staring wide-eyed into a face filled with hundreds of eyes. Most would call it an eldritch horror. As soon as it came, the monster disappeared, and was replaced with Midoriya once more. The death grip let up, and he stepped back into the seat on the other side of the hospital room. A beat passed. Midoriya shot up from his seat and headed toward the door. "Bye-bye." He waved his hand cheerfully, looking as much of the innocent kid as he portrayed. He left the room, leaving Hawks to his thoughts. Shoto was antsy. He wanted someone to kill. Izuku's blood was rubbing off on him. What better way to quench his thirst for violence than to go after one of his former classmates? Zero Hanta. The boy was walking through the mall on a settee. Something was bound to happen. Silently, Shoto crept up behind him and froze up his elbows so he couldn't use his quirk. The hero student whipped his body around to fend off his attacker. The move would have succeeded had he not recognized the face of the one attacking him. That slight moment of hesitancy cost the boy his life, as it gave Shoto the opportunity to punch his lights out, call Kurogiri, and successfully kidnap him. Zero woke up in a dimly lit room. He had quirk suppressants on and was tied to a chair. In front of him stood a familiar figure. The red and white split hair gave him away easily. Todoroki, Zero said, "Why are you doing this?" Zero has been exposed to the sheer power of the person in front of him at the sports festival, so he was afraid of the possibilities that him being here makes. Todoroki didn't say anything, but merely walked forward and put his hands around Zero's neck, slowly squeezing tighter and tighter. As he suffocated Zero, a wide, demented smile appeared on his face. Before Zero could lose consciousness, the hands let go. He was bent partially over, breathing heavily. The hero hopeful looked up at Shoto, eyes half-lidded and afraid. The door opened behind Shoto, and a voice called out from the doorway, "Hey, Shu, what were you doing?" He stopped as he made eye contact with the hostage. Hitoshi's question died out as he made eye contact with his classmate, of whom he had been chatting with at the UA gym not 2 hours ago. Zero jolted up, yet was kept down by his restraints. "Shinsu-kun, what are you doing here? Did they kidnap you too?" Hitoshi laughed mirthfully. He walked over to the hero student and grabbed his chin between two of his fingers. Hitoshi yanked up on Zero's face and leaned down so that the two were face to face. Hitoshi at his lips menacingly, "Kidnapped, by my own boyfriend." His smile was what some would call demented. He pushed back on Zero's face, making his head slam into the back of his chair, damaging his neck. Shoto couldn't help it. He pulled Hitoshi into a heated kiss as he injured Zero. There was so much happening, it made Shoto euphoric. The mixture of inflicting pain and experiencing pleasure was amazing to him. He let go of Hitoshi and turned to Zero, who had passed out briefly from the blunt force. He lit his hand on fire and placed it on Zero's neck, eliciting a scream of pure agony from the boy. It was music to his ears, especially as the hero student started crying. He let his left hand off his neck, and used the right one as a freezer burn blister. It probably felt good for half a second before the pain of the freezing ice set in on the sensitive burned skin. It was how his mother scarred him. A frozen burn. He lifted that hand off after a few seconds as well. Zero's throat was raw from screaming. It's not like they were trained how to handle torture, because it wasn't anticipated that it was something the hero students would have to endure. Izuku was most definitely rubbing off on both of them. Hitoshi suddenly sang out, "Hanta-chan." Zero visibly recoiled at it. What? That was how Zero got under Hitoshi's control. His smile was all teeth. "Swallow your own tongue." The mindless zombie did as told, and Hitoshi could feel his connection break as soon as the boy started choking. He turned to look at Shoto. "Sorry for ruining your spotlight, babe." Shoto just waved his apology off, not really minding. He wrapped Hitoshi up into a hug. "I'm just glad you're not mad I took one of your acquaintances." Shoto responded. He buried his face into Hitoshi's shoulder as Hitoshi hugged him tighter. "Truth be told," Hitoshi went on, "I was actually just getting close to him so that I could do something like this. So we were essentially thinking the same thing." Shoto smiled. It was a small, genuine one. He lifted his head up from Hitoshi's shoulder and giggled lightly at the blush on Hitoshi's face. The duo looked back towards Zero and saw that he had asphyxiated. Shoto went up to him, took out a pocket knife, opened Zero's shirt, and carved out the word inertia onto his chest. Inertia," said Hitoshi from behind him. Shoto nodded. "Yeah, it's like the opposite of endeavor. So I thought it was perfect." "Yes," Hitoshi agreed, "it is indeed perfect, Shu." Izuku was at the station, unaware of the havoc his boyfriends were causing. Not that he would mind. He was idly doing some reports given to him by Tsukachi. They were kidnapping cases of quirkless people. As he looked at the list of names, he recognized some of the faces. They were some of the doctor's patients for the creation of Nomus. It was unfortunate, really. Quirkless people were the only people who could harness all those quirks and regain their intelligence. Though the Nomus, who were called high-end, was still a work in progress. He looked up at the sound of someone calling his name, only to find it was Eraserhead, Class 1A's homeroom teacher. The man looked tired, almost unnaturally so. Must have something to do with his quirk. "Oi, Green, you finished with those reports yet? The detective needs them soon." Izuku scrambled to finish, as he realized he'd been zoning out. Sorry, Eraserhead-senpai." He laughed inwardly as he saw the man's eye twitch. Eraserhead audibly sighed. "Don't call me that here, kid. Just call me Aizawa." Izuku beamed the brightest smile he could muster. This meant that he basically blinded the grumpy man. "Okay, Aizawa-senpai." The man grumbled. "Better." Izuku soon finished the reports and gave them to the disheveled man. He hummed some random tune while Aizawa went to give the reports to Tsukachi, whose mental state was on the downhill. This was obvious by the way he has struggled to see simple solutions laid out in front of him. That and his jumpy attitude toward everyone around him. The coffee supply in the office was dwindling due to the amount that man consumed on a daily basis. Izuku could sense that it had something to do with his own case, and the fact that there's barely been any lead on him besides that screw-up a few weeks ago. Tsukachi eventually called him into his office. "Thank you for having those reports in so quickly. There's been a lot of stress around here, as you can most likely imagine." Izuku smiled in a way that he hoped was reassuring, and it seemed to have worked when the detective relaxed a little. "I understand, Tsukachi-senpai. I'm always happy to help." The man gave a tired smile and, out of seemingly nowhere, he said, "Call me Naomasa, Midoriya." Izuku stopped and blinked for a few seconds. Oh, okay. Call me Izuku then." He smiled very brightly, which made Naomasa's smile a little brighter. He bade the detective goodbye for the day soon after. Before he could leave, however, the station got a call of villain activity right outside UAS gate. Izuku decided to go with them. When they got there, they found Shoto just stepping inside Kurogiri's portal. When it closed, the police focused on the body that was left. Zero Hanta, a Class 1 hero student. Inwardly, Izuku was proud of Shoto. Outwardly, he started to panic. His hands went onto either side of his nose, so it looked like he was praying as he crouched low to the ground and put his head down. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Aizawa break down. The man fell onto his knees in front of the body. He wasn't too far from it himself, so he could see the damage. The boy's neck was mangled. It was burnt looking, but it had frozen fractals still around it. There was no tongue in the mouth, yet there was a bump in the throat that revealed where it went. There's almost no way someone could swallow their own tongue, except for one. Hitoshi must have helped Shoto do the torturing. He must have been staring for too long, because one of the other police officers put a comforting hand on his back. It didn't really help Izuku, but it was nice. Looking at the body, it made his blood rise. He wanted to kill something. He buried his head deeper into his hands. Unknowingly, his teeth were sharpening, and his tongue grew long and forked. Once he realized it, he stood up abruptly and ran from the scene. It was getting dark outside, and he walked to the shadier parts of Misutafu. Instead of looking for a victim, he let a victim find him. His blood only rose from there. He turned his hair black and his eyes red. Then, he made his freckles disappear and his face a little more angular. It didn't stop people from recognizing him, but only after staring for longer than normal. It was perfect though for an off-base description of him. He bumped into a burly-looking man, hoping for a fight. Unluckily, the man was a regular at the villain hub and recognized his features. He ran off, but not before bowing low to Izuku, who blinked in confusion. He kept walking until he ran into someone else, a woman who sneered in disgust at the sight of him. "What's a quirkless degenerate like you doing out here?" "Ooh, how exciting." He found his old English teacher from Aldera. Izuku couldn't help it, he started laughing. Before the woman could say anything else, the laughing cut off abruptly. He punched her sternum hard enough to fling her into the brick wall of a building. She cried out in pain, and he went up to her and twisted her right arm in 2 different directions until he heard the distinct snap of a bone breaking into pieces. His hand transformed into a claw and he drove it bone deep into the other arm. The woman fell to her knees onto the rough pavement. Izuku at his lips, revealing a long, forked tongue. The woman in front of him was looking up at him and shaking in pure terror. "Who are you and what have you done with that stupid Deku?" The laugh he gave was reminiscent of a hyena. "Deku has been gone for long enough," he got all up in her face. "Now, he is never coming back." He gave a cruel, wicked smile as the shadows grew around the two of them. They were twisted and warped, and they continued to spread throughout the alleyway. He stood from where he was crouched, and swiftly kicked the woman in the head. There was a distinct crack that emanated from her head as it landed on the rough pavement. But she was still breathing, so it didn't kill her. It just knocked her out. He decided to fix that. He did to her what he did to Uebami, that is, ripping out both of her eyelids so she could only be awake. The scream that erupted from her was joyous. There was so much terror coming from the woman that Izuku soaked it all up for a moment. When he had stood there for long enough, he quickly sliced the front of her neck. As she bled, he drank from her neck like a vampire, and once he was satisfied, he bit her head clear off, making the body slump like a puppet with its strings cut. He stepped on top of the body's sternum, and pressed down with enough force to crack the pavement below. This action reduced the body to mangled parts, enough for him to eat without any resistance. He bent down and ate his fill, reducing the mangled pile to mere bone. He left the heart for last, as it was his delicacy. His fingers dug into the brick of the building, and he curled them so that anything he stuck there would stay. He did the same thing to the wall 5 other times. After doing this, he stuck the woman's limbs into the indentations, and he made them stay. This action made the woman look crucified. He couldn't stop smiling even if he tried. He took the heart and unhinged his jaw to bite down on it in one go. His form shimmered in and out of view. It looked as though there were extra bones growing from his person. His back, specifically. He didn't grow into the creature immediately, but rather his limbs slowly extended to the point where he was comfortably on all fours, with his back legs double-jointed and his hands and feet turned into claws. It seemed he reached some sort of threshold. All at once, he was the creature once more, yet he was more sleek, and he felt something foreign on his back. He twisted his neck around, and was surprised to see wings. He needed to get home and tell his mom. Good timing too. He could hear police sirens coming his way. He jumped up to the top of the building that was in front of him, shrunk a little, and made his way home. Inko was enjoying a nice cup of tea when her son burst into the house, out of breath. Mom, I have wings. Inko nearly spit out her tea. Her people only get wings after about 50 years. Let me see, sweetie. Izuku obliged, and transformed. Inko hadn't realized how large his form was. That is, until he grew to the size of the living room, and his form shimmered, indicating that he was able to grow more. This also wasn't a gradual change. There were no stubs of wing bone, but rather full-length bone that stretched out several yards at their full extension. Oh honey, Inko started, I'm so proud of you. No one ever gets their wings this fast. She didn't miss the questioning look shot her way. Of course you know you aren't human, honey, a nod. Well, you're also not the only one of your kind. That elicited a slight shrink in size and a prance around the living room couch. Oh yes, I have so many questions, Mom. She raised her hand up, yes, of course. However, I can't tell you all at once. Her eyes darted around the room. We never know who may be listening. Paranoia was obviously getting to the both of them. Inko held up her hand, holding her index finger up. First of all, you have me, she gestured to herself. I'm your mother, which means I'm the same as you. However, she went up to him and pinched his cheeks. You're a lot more powerful than me or anyone of our kind. Izuku beamed at her. Earlier, Aizawa collapsed to his knees at the sight of his student. His clearly tortured student. His very dead student. He hesitantly wiped the tears from his eyes. In his peripheral vision, he saw the intern fall to the ground similarly. He hoped someone would get the kid out of here. The kid was shaking violently at the sight, and the only thing keeping himself from doing the same was sheer willpower. A few heavy sobs escaped him, his failure as a teacher weighing down on the police squad. The body sat there, cooling, and a wave of anger swept through the hero. Anger towards the villains behind this. A few moments later, his anger was burnt out for the time being. Regardless, he had classes to run and students to comfort. Aizawa slowly rose from his knees to see the Midoriya kid gone, apparently having run off. At least he didn't have to bear the sight of a corpse anymore. Poor thing. It was the next day in Class 1A. They had just said the news about Sira the night before, so the mood was somber. Aizawa came in as the bell rang, clearly distraught but hiding it as best he could. The class was working on an assignment, and Uraraka tapped on Hitoshi's shoulder. He turned around to look at her in question. She kindly asked him for an eraser. He shrugged and let her borrow one. As he dropped it into her hand, she saw that it was a kitten-shaped eraser, and she thought to herself, we don't deserve him. He's too pure. Hitoshi, unaware of this thought, went through his day like normal, and looked for any information his teachers had gathered on anything villain-related. As he struggled with how rambunctious his class was, he thought of the feeling of that office worker's spine under his foot, and that made him feel better. Izuku went to the villain hub, this time bringing Shoto. Shoto had never been, and therefore didn't have any reputation there. He had a general reputation already, just being a former hero student and the son of Endeavor. While this did him good already, he needed new connections besides just the League of Villains. That's why when they walked into Cadillac, Shoto tightened his hold of Izuku's hand as every villain in the restaurant turned to look at them. Izuku, used to the attention, squeezed his hand in a reassuring gesture, and smiled creepily at those who were staring. Most of them hastily looked away, not wanting to incur the wrath of the most wanted villain in Japan. Izuku introduced to the crowd the villain Inertia. Shoto was currently a class, and therefore was to be treated with respect. No one dared question him. After all, it wasn't hard to recognize the former hero student who dominated the UA Sports Festival. Izuku also reintroduced himself along with his new ranking of SS class. The room gave a collective shiver at that tidbit. Izuku enjoyed the aura of fear that resonated throughout the restaurant as they all collectively realized what that meant. There was a new boogeyman of the underground. And it was a child. It was the weekend, and Class 1A needed a break from the sit that they'd been through. So, to the mall it was, despite its track record thus far. Izuku got this information from Hitoshi, so he thought it was a perfect time to make a new friend in that class. He walked around the food court of the mall, and spied his first 1A student. It was Hitoshi, naturally. He excitedly ran up to him and launched himself into the arms of the boy. Toshi, I haven't seen you in like 2 days, Izuku exclaimed. Hitoshi gave a small, genuine smile that had his other friends gaping at the sight of. The two let go of their hug, and Izuku turned to face the group he was with. Hi, I'm Midoriya Izuku. The group of friends had already grabbed their drinks, and as they took a sip, he said, I'm Toshi's boyfriend. They choked on their respective drinks, and Izuku let out a laugh. Hitoshi's friend group introduced themselves, in order of right to left. There was Ida Tenya, Uraraka Achako, Asuitsuyu, Takoyami Fumikage, and Yaoyorozu Momo. Oh, this is so exciting, exclaimed Uraraka. Shinsu-kun hasn't mentioned anyone outside of school, so I was getting worried that he didn't have any friends besides us. Hitoshi fed, making a very slight pouting face. Rude, I have a friend. It's Izuku. At the sound of his name, said boy lit up in joy, and practically blinded the friend group with his smile. Takoyami muttered under his breath, revelry in the dark. Izuku blinked and focused his attention on the bird-headed boy who, upon realizing that the attention had shifted to him, hunched his shoulders inward slightly. My apologies, it's a force of habit. That's okay, I just wasn't expecting it, said Izuku. The 7 of them went to a nearby restaurant, where they ate lunch, and were greeted by other members of the class. Izuku saw Katsuki before the blonde saw him. Kaken, he exclaimed. The blonde whipped his head to the green-haired boy. Deku, he slowly nodded toward him, throwing Izuku for a loop. He wasn't expecting such a cordial greeting, as it was so unlike the Katsuki he knew. As the blonde turned away, he saw the red-haired boy behind Katsuki, Kirishima Ijiru. The boy was watching him like a hawk, and it made Izuku slightly nervous. He got up from where he was sitting, gave Hitoshi a light kiss on the cheek, which made his friends coo at them. He walked over to Kirishima and greeted him. Hi, Kirishima-san, right. The boy gave a cautious nod, looking around at his other friends, who didn't seem to catch on to the tension both boys exuded. Now that he was closer, he could see the sweat in the red-haired boy's brow, indicating stress. He looked toward his friends and told them that he was going to speak to Izuku in private for a moment. They walked out of earshot from the group, and Kirishima didn't say anything for a moment. Izuku wasn't sure what he should say, but luckily, he didn't need to say anything, because the look in Kirishima's eyes intensified, making Izuku take a step backward. "Hey Kirishima-san," he shakily asked, "what is it? Don't play dumb with me." Izuku stopped from where he was about to gesture to the group behind them. He set his head to the side in a decidedly inhuman way. "I don't understand what you mean." There was a look of white-hot anger on Kirishima's face for a brief moment. "My best friend Denki is missing his right arm, and right now, his dropout from the hero course is pending." That confused Izuku. "Can't UAS support course do anything to work around it?" Kirishima blinked, opening his mouth, before closing it again. It seemed that he hadn't thought of that. All the tension was gone from Izuku in an instant. The teen lit up and spouted at least 25 different ways the support course could help those missing an arm. He was about to continue his enthusiastic rant, but he was stopped. Kirishima was about to continue when Hitoshi came over and stood beside Izuku, offering his support with whatever it was that they were dealing with. "Kirishima." Hitoshi's dead-sounding voice cut through the conversation like a knife. According to Uraraka, it was similar to their teacher. So maybe that was why when his name was called out, the boy stood more alert. Hitoshi put his arm around Izuku. "What did you need from Izuku that's taken this long to say?" The red-haired boy momentarily fumbled, before saying, "Isn't he?" He stopped and turned to Izuku. "Aren't you the one who did it to Denki?" Izuku blinked. "Huh." Hitoshi snorted and lightly patted Izuku's head. "This green bean ain't capable of any violence." His voice turned serious. "There's actually a villain going around and claiming to be him. Bakugo can tell you about it." He gestured to where Bakugo was standing. "So whatever you think Izuku may have done, it's most likely his doppelganger." Kirishima's face turned red in embarrassment, and he bowed low to Izuku. "I'm so sorry, bro. I guess I was suspicious of you for nothing then." He laughed lightly as he stood up. Kirishima went back to join the others, but Izuku and Hitoshi stayed behind. "That was too close, Zuku," he muttered. Izuku nodded his head in agreement, burying his face into Hitoshi's shoulder. They stood there together for a moment, before also going back and joining the others.